One story told in hundreds of languages that never met, one disaster that no map of the world can quite locate, and one clay tablet, older than the Bible, that tells it almost exactly the way you already know it. In 1914, working through tablets dug from the Sumerian holy city of Nippur, the Assyriologist Arno Pobel published a broken text that should not have existed. It described a great flood sent to wipe out mankind, a single man warned to build a boat, and the saving of the seed of every living thing. The names were wrong, the God was wrong, but the story was the one half the planet had grown up on, set down in clay more than 1,000 years before the book of Genesis was written. And here is the detail that the standard reading has never been able to fully settle. It is not only Mesopotamia. From the rivers of China to the highlands of Mexico to the islands of the Pacific, hundreds of separate cultures, most of whom could never have spoken to one another, tell the same shape of story, a world that drowned and a handful who lived to begin again. Tonight we follow that one story across the world, the flooded city that first wrote it down, the round boat the oldest version describes, and the slow, real drowning the end of the Ice Age left behind. If you find these stories quieting, subscribing is the easiest way to let the next one reach you. Settle in. We begin on a flat river plain, underwater that is rising. Start not with the tablet, but with the strangeness that the tablet is only one example of. Sit down with the folklore of the world, the old stories each people told about how things began and how they nearly ended. Threaded through an extraordinary number of them, you would find the same disaster, not fire, not war, not famine, water. A flood that rose over the known world, drowned almost everyone, and left a small remnant to start the human story again. The Hebrews told it of Noah, the Greeks told it of Deucalion, who rode out the deluge in a chest and repopulated the earth by throwing stones over his shoulder. In India, Manu is warned by a fish and builds a vessel. In the Americas, across dozens of unconnected nations, a survivor outlasts a world-ending flood on a raft, or a mountain, or the back of an animal. The lists run to the hundreds. This is the thing to hold as we begin, because it is genuinely difficult to explain. These were not people in contact. A storyteller in the Andes, and a scribe on the Euphrates, and a grandmother in the Ganges Valley were not comparing notes. And yet, again and again, the disaster they reached for was the same one, and they remembered it the same way. A warning, a vessel, a rising water that covers the world, and afterward a fragile new beginning. There are two honest ways to read that, and we are going to keep both of them in view the whole way through tonight, on two separate shelves, because the moment you let them touch you get nonsense. The first reading is the careful one. A flood is simply the disaster every river valley people fears most, so of course many of them independently made a great myth out of it. The second is the one that will not quite go away, that the stories are this similar and this widespread, because somewhere underneath them is something that actually happened, not one event perhaps, but a real shared experience of water taking the land, deep enough in time that it survived only as a story. We're not going to pretend the second reading is proven. It is not, but we're not going to dismiss the pattern either, because the pattern is real, and the people who study it for a living have never fully agreed on what to do with it. The oldest written version of the story we have does not come from the Bible. It comes from a city that by the time anyone wrote it down had already drowned once before. Picture a flat brown plain in southern Iraq, the kind of land where the horizon is just a line, where the dust meets the sky. The two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, run through it, slow and heavy, and every spring they rise. Most years the rising is a blessing. It lays down the silt that makes the fields. Some years it is not. Some years the water comes up faster than anyone alive has seen, and the mud-brick towns, built low on the plain with nowhere to climb, simply go under. On that plain stood a city called Shuruppak. It was old even by Sumerian standards, one of the cities the king lists name as ruling before the Great Flood, and it mattered to this story for a reason. You can still see in the ground, when archaeologists dug down through the layers of Shuruppak in the early 20th century, they found, sealed between the city's occupation levels, a thick band of clean, river-laid clay, a flood deposit, the silent record of a day the water rose over the whole town and stayed. It is not the flood of the myth. It is too small and too local for that. But it is the kind of thing that makes a city remember water as the end of the world. And it was Shuruppak that the Sumerians named as the home of their flood hero. In their telling, his name was Zasudra. The name means something close to life of long days, a man granted a span beyond the ordinary. He was a king or a priest-king of this low river city, and in the oldest version of the story, recovered from those Nippur tablets, it is to Ziusudra that the warning comes. The warning is the hinge of every version of this story, and it is worth noticing who gives it. The gods, in the Sumerian telling, have decided to destroy mankind. The texts are not always clear why, but the decision is made in the divine assembly, and it is meant to be secret. One god breaks the secret. It is Enki, the god of the deep fresh water and of wisdom, the same cunning god who keeps turning up in these stories on the side of humanity. And in the way the Mesopotamian tradition tells it, he does not warn the man openly. He speaks instead to a reed wall, so that technically he has told no one, while the man on the other side of the wall hears every word. What Enki tells him to do is the part the whole world would remember, and the oldest description of how to do it is stranger than the picture in your head. There is a second Mesopotamian version of the story, older in the form we have it than the famous one, and it is the one that gives us the building instructions. It is the Epic of Atrahasis. The name is another epithet, meaning exceedingly wise, used for the same flood hero under a different mask, and for a long time the Atrahasis flood was known only in damaged pieces, the crucial lines about the boat broken away. Then, in our own century, the missing piece arrived, a British Museum curator named Irving Finkel, a cuneiform specialist, the kind of man who can read clay the way you read this page, was shown a small tablet that had been sitting in a private collection since a soldier brought it home from the Middle East after the Second World War. Finkel read it and realized he was holding the lost flood instructions. He told the story in a book he called The Ark Before Noah, and the detail that made the headlines was the shape of the boat. It was round. The tablet does not describe a ship with a bow and a stern. It describes a coracle, a vast circular vessel of the kind Iraqi rivermen still built within. Living memory, a great basket of woven reed sealed watertight with bitumen, the black tar that wells up naturally from the ground in that country. The instructions are precise to the point of being a specification, the quantities of rope, the coils of palm fibre, the fields of reed, the tons of bitumen smeared inside and out. Finkel and others worked out the dimensions the tablet implied, and they are enormous. A circle of woven reed covering most of a football pitch, with walls as high as a house. Whether such a thing could ever have floated is a separate argument. What matters is that this is not vague myth. This is a man being told in engineer's language exactly how to survive the end of the world. And the cargo is the line you already know. Take a board, the god says, the seed of all living things, your family, the animals, the breath of life. Then seal the door. Then the rain comes. 7 days and 7 nights, the texts say. the storm and the flood, together, until the gods themselves are frightened by what they have done, and cower, the epic says, like dogs against the wall of heaven. When the storm finally breaks, the boat is alone on a drowned world, and what the flood hero does next, in the most famous version of all, is a sequence so specific that reading it slowly is the only way to feel how old it is. The version most people have actually heard, even without knowing it, comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Late in that poem, the hero Gilgamesh, hunting for the secret of eternal life, finds the one man who survived the flood and was made immortal for it. In this telling, the survivor is called Utnapishtim, and he sits Gilgamesh down and tells him the whole story. The standard scholarly translation is Andrew George's, made from the standard Babylonian text, and the lines about the end of the flood run, in part, "When the seventh day arrived, I brought out a dove and let it loose. The dove went off, then it came back, for no resting place was visible to it, and it turned round. I brought out a swallow and let it loose, for no resting place was visible to it, and it turned round. I brought out a raven and let it loose. The raven went off, and it saw the waters receding. It ate, it circled, it bobbed, it did not come round." Read that slowly, because almost every word of it survived for thousands of years before reaching you. When the seventh day arrived, the waiting is counted the way you count days when you are trapped. I brought out a dove and let it loose. The survivor cannot see past the water himself, so he sends out a creature that can, a way of asking the world a question and reading the answer in what comes back. It came back, for no resting place was visible, still nothing but water, and then the raven. And the raven does not return, because the raven has found the receding water, and the first bared mud, and it stays to feed. The bird that does not come back is the good news. The silence is the signal. If that motion feels familiar, it should. The same sequence, the survivor, the boat run aground, the birds sent out one after another to test for dry land, sits almost line for line in the story of Noah. Written down centuries later, the boat in the Babylonian version comes to rest on a single mountain that holds it fast, and does not let it move, named in the text as Mount Nimush. The biblical version names a different mountain. The shape underneath is the same. This is the heart of why this story unsettles people. Not that two traditions tell of a flood, but that they tell it with the same furniture, in the same order, down to the testing of dry land with birds. Scholars have understood for over a century that the older Mesopotamian story is one source, the biblical one drew from. But Mesopotamia and the Bible share a neighbourhood. The harder question is the rest of the world. Step back now from the rivers of Iraq and look at the whole map, because this is where the story stops being a regional family resemblance and becomes the thing. That genuinely puzzles the people who study it. The folklorist Sir James Fraser, working a century ago, gathered flood legends from cultures across the world and laid them side by side. Later scholars went further. The most cited modern study of these stories, the volume the anthropologist Alan Dundes assembled, draws on a body of roughly 300 separate flood myths, gathered from every inhabited continent. 300 stories from peoples who, in many cases, had no possible contact with one another across the whole span of recorded history, and yet had each arrived at a tale of a world drowned and a remnant saved. The similarities are not vague. In version after version on different sides of the planet you find the same recurring pieces. A divine decision to destroy humanity, often as punishment. A single warned survivor, sometimes a chosen man, sometimes a brother and sister who become the parents of a new race. A vessel, a boat, a raft, a hollow log, a great gourd, a rising water that covers even the mountains. And afterward, the careful business of beginning again, the sending out of birds, the offering of thanks, the slow repopulation of an emptied world. When a single image recurs this widely across cultures, this isolated from each other, the mind reaches for an explanation, and there are really only a few on offer. Perhaps the human imagination simply runs in the same grooves. Perhaps a great flood is the most natural way for any people to picture a clean ending and a fresh start, and so many of us invented it separately. Perhaps the story spread, slowly, from a few origins, carried along trade routes and migrations over thousands of years, until they were everywhere. Or perhaps, and this is the reading that refuses to die, the stories are this common because so many peoples genuinely lived through rising water in the deep past, and the memory of it outlasted everything else they knew. That detail seems small. It is not. We will come back to it, because it is the bridge between the myth and the only part of this we can actually measure. But before we cross that bridge, honesty demands we look at the places where the story is missing, because the most important fact about the worldwide flood myth is the one the sensational version always leaves out, and it cuts directly against the idea that everyone, everywhere, remembers the same drowning. Here is the correction the careful scholars insist on, and it matters more than any single tablet. The flood myth is not universal. It is widespread, which is remarkable enough, but it is not everywhere, and the places it is missing are exactly the places that would matter if you wanted to claim that all of humanity carries the memory of one drowning across most of sub-Saharan Africa, the continent where our species began, where human memory is oldest. Flood stories are sparse, and in many regions effectively absent. It is true across large parts of China. Fraser, a century ago, overstated the case. He wrote as if the flood story were practically a human universal, and later scholars have spent a great deal of effort gently correcting him, mapping the real distribution and finding it patchy. And the distribution, when you map it honestly, tells you something. Flood myths cluster where floods cluster, in the great river valleys and along the coasts, and on the islands, in the places where, for the people living there, rising water really was the most plausible end of the world. They thin out in the deserts and the high, dry interiors, where the end of the world, if you had to imagine one, would more likely come as drought or fire. This is the single most important guardrail on the whole subject, so let us state it plainly. The pattern is not every human being everywhere remembers a single global flood. If it were, the deserts and the dry plateaus and the deep African interior would remember it too, and they largely do not. The pattern is narrower and, in a way, more interesting. The people who lived where water could take the land remembered water taking the land. The story is not a fingerprint left by one event on all of humanity. It is the natural shape that the worst fear of river and coast peoples took, repeated independently wherever that fear was real. Which sounds, at first, like the end of the mystery. The orthodox reading wins. There was no one great flood. People who feared floods made flood myths. And for the literal global deluge, that is the end of it. But it leaves one thread hanging, and the thread is this. The peoples who built these stories were not imagining an impossible thing. In the deep past, in exactly the river valleys and coastlines where these stories cluster thickest, the water genuinely did rise. Not in 40 days, but it rose, and it rose far enough to swallow whole countries. And that part is not myth. Before we reach the measurement, sit for a moment with what kind of disaster a great flood actually is, because it is unlike any other, and its strangeness is the key to everything that follows. Think of the other endings a people might fear. A war leaves ruins, burned walls, broken weapons, mass graves, the hard evidence of what happened, sitting on the surface for anyone to find. A plague leaves bones, a fire leaves ash and char. A volcano, as we will see another time, can bury a world and preserve it perfectly under stone. These are catastrophes that leave a body. They can be excavated. They can be argued over with a trowel. Water does the opposite. Water rises, covers the land, and then, this is the cruel part, it stays, or it leaves behind only smooth mud and silt, and the land that drowned is simply gone. There are no ruins to find, because the ruins are under the sea. There are no graves to dig, because the graveyards are 60 metres down on a continental shelf no archaeologist visited until the last few decades. A flood is the one great disaster that erases its own evidence as it happens. It does not leave a scar you can stand beside. It leaves only water. And the people who watched it, and whatever those people managed to say to their children before they died, hold that against what we have just been describing. Where, in the human record, would the memory of a real, slow, land-swallowing flood actually survive? Not in the ground, because the ground is under water. Not in the buildings, because the buildings are gone. It would survive in only one place, in the story, in the thing a grandmother tells a child by a fire, who tells it to her own children, who carry it inland as the coast retreats. Until the coast they fled is 100 miles out to sea, and the only thing left of it is a tale about a world that drowned. This is why the flood myth and the flood evidence look so mismatched, and why the argument never resolves. The skeptic says, correctly, that there is no physical trace of a single worldwide deluge, and there is not. The believer says, also correctly, that the absence of a trace is exactly what a great drowning would leave behind. Both are right, because they are describing the one disaster designed to leave a memory and no body. And the deepest, oldest such drowning we can actually point to was not a punishment from the gods. It was the end of an age of ice. That is where the science finally meets the story. Here is the contested claim, stated first and fairly. Some have argued that the worldwide flood myths are a true folk memory of a real, planet-wide rise in the sea at the end of the Ice Age, that the stories are history, badly compressed. That is the strong version, and most scientists do not accept it, because the timescales do not match a single 40-day event, and the stories cannot be carried reliably across that many thousands of years. Keep that skepticism in hand. Now the finding, which is not contested at all, around 20,000 years ago the planet was deep in the last glacial maximum. So much of the world's water was locked into ice sheets kilometres thick that the sea stood roughly 120 metres lower than it does today. Whole regions that are now seabed were dry, living land, and the sea began to climb, and it did not climb at one steady pace. It came in surges, the largest of them, which geologists call Meltwater Pulse 1A, struck around 14,500 years ago, when a vast volume of meltwater poured off the collapsing ice sheets in a geological instant. The studies put it at something like 14 to 18 metres of sea level rise in only 3 or 4 centuries, fast enough in places to take several metres of coastline within a single human lifetime. Picture what that meant for the people living it. A bay that your grandfather fished as a marsh is open water by the time you are old. A path to an island your family walked at low tide is gone, and the island is shrinking. A coastline retreats not in a single drowning night, but across generations relentlessly, never coming back. There was no global flood with an arc. There was something slower and, in its way, more total. A world that got smaller every year for centuries and drove every coastal people steadily inland. Coincidence, then, or memory? The careful answer is the honest one. We cannot prove that any flood myth descends from the end of the Ice Age. The gap is too wide, the evidence too thin, and a flood is the obvious story for any river people to invent. But we no longer have to pretend the people who told these stories were imagining the impossible. They lived in a world where the sea really had risen and swallowed the land, where there really were drowned countries just over the horizon their ancestors had walked. The myth says the water came and took the world. For thousands of years in slow motion, along every coast on earth, the water came and took the world. The story is not the science, but the science is no longer a reason to dismiss the story. So we are left with the question we started with, and it is sharper now. Why do so many separate peoples remember the same drowned world? The orthodox answer is clean, and it is largely right, and we should say so. There was no single global flood. The geology forbids it. The flood myth is not universal. It is missing from the deserts and the dry interiors and much of Africa, exactly where it should be present if it were a memory shared by all humanity. Where it does appear, it appears because a flood is the natural nightmare of any people who live where water can rise, and many such peoples invented their great flood independently, then passed the story down and sometimes traded it along the way. On this reading, the worldwide flood is not a fact about the past. It is a fact about the human imagination and about geography. That explanation accounts for almost everything. What it accounts for less easily is the timing and the texture, because the people who told these stories were not living in a stable world that they merely feared might flood. They were living in the aftermath of the greatest sustained drowning the planet has known since. Humans warped it, the long rise at the end of the Ice Age, which really did swallow whole countries, really did drive their ancestors inland, and really did leave nothing behind but water, and whatever was said around the fire. The orthodox reading is right, that there was no single deluge. It is the alternative reading that asks the better question, when a real, world-altering rise in the sea coincides exactly with the kind of disaster that survives only as a story. Should we be surprised that so much of the coastal world tells the same one? We do not have to decide tonight, and we should not pretend we can. The oldest flood tablet sits in its case in a museum, broken and quiet. The round boat lives only in lines of cuneiform. The drowned coasts lie under the sea, beyond the reach of any trowel, keeping their evidence to themselves the way water always has. What remains is the story, the most widely told, most stubbornly repeated story our species owns, and the slow, real water underneath it that we can finely measure but never fully connect. Next week we go further back still, to a drowning of a different kind, not water but ash, and not a coastline but the whole sky, in the eruption that some believe nearly ended us. For now there is nothing to decide and nothing to fear. Let the water lie smooth over the old plain and the boat rest empty on the shore. Drift down. A clay prism in Oxford, a carved stone disc in Mexico City, and a quiet agreement between them that no one ever arranged. Four peoples who never met set down the same idea: the scribes of Mesopotamia, the poets of early Greece, the priests of central Mexico, the astronomers of India. Each wrote it in their own clay and stone and palm leaf, with no road running between them. The idea that ours is not the first world, only the latest. Scholars read each of these accounts on its own as one people's private myth, and left it there. But laid side by side, they do not behave like four separate myths. They behave like four copies of one older thing. Because they do not only agree that earlier worlds existed, they agree on something far more specific and far harder to set aside. They agree on the small list of ways a world ends: by water, by fire, by wind, by cold, and by the turning of beasts upon people. They even tend to agree on the order, from a soft first world down to a hard last one. Tonight we follow the flood that drew the first line, the 5 ages that turned down like a worn staircase, and the 4 suns that already set. If you find these stories calming, the easiest way to let another reach you next week is to subscribe, and then let yourself drift. Settle in. We begin before the first ending. Start with the feeling, because the records start there too. There is a quiet suspicion that sits in most people somewhere, rarely said out loud, that the history we were handed begins too late, that something stood before the beginning we were given. We tend to set the feeling aside, because the loudest people carrying it are usually selling a drowned continent, so we look away from the feeling, and we lose the question with it. The oldest writers did not look away. This is the part the standard account leads you to expect least. We picture ancient people as the children of the human story, wide-eyed and early, standing at the dawn of everything. But the scribes who first cut words into clay did not feel early. They felt late. Their oldest documents do not open with a creation and march forward into the present. They open by looking backward over a wall at worlds that had already fallen. And here is the detail that turns a feeling into a problem worth a whole night. It is not only the Mesopotamians who did this. The same backward look surfaces in places that had no contact with Mesopotamia and no contact with each other. In early Greece, in the river valleys of India, in the volcanic highlands of Mexico, different languages, different gods, different centuries, and underneath them all the same shape. They ended. A shared idea, we could explain, 4 peoples could each arrive on their own. Had the bare thought that worlds end, the way 4 peoples each worked out that a year runs roughly 365 days because the sky told all of them the same thing, that much we can set aside. What we cannot set aside so easily is that they agreed on the inventory. Not just that worlds end, but how, and the list is short, and it repeats. That is the thing this story is about, not the number of worlds which we counted on another night, the catalogue of endings, the specific ways the world was said to be taken away, again and again, by peoples who could not have compared notes. So tonight we are going to read the real records, the ones in real museums with real dates of publication, and ask a narrower question than usual. Not how many worlds, but what each one was, and what ended it, and why the same few endings keep coming back. We will keep the fantasy at arm's length, and we will keep the genuine puzzle in full view, because it is genuine. The first record we read drew the oldest line of all, and it drew it in water. Begin where the counting began, 4,500 years ago, with a document that does something most documents never attempt. It begins before its own world. The text is the one scholars call the Sumerian King List, and its most complete copy survives on a 4-sided clay prism in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, published in 1923 by the scholar Stephen Langdon. On its surface it is the dullest thing imaginable, a roster of kings and the cities they ruled and the years they reigned, the kind of paperwork a kingdom keeps to prove it has the right to exist. But the list does not start with the first king. It starts with a line that drops the floor away. When kingship had descended from heaven, that is how it opens. Kingship was first in a city called Eridu, in the marshes near the Gulf. Eridu is a real place. You can walk its mound today, dug down through temple built on temple, to one of the oldest sacred sites yet found anywhere. And in that first city, the list says, a king ruled for 28,800 years. The reigns that follow are just as vast. 8 kings, city to city, before anything we would call history. And then the list says one short sentence, and the whole world it has been describing simply stops. Then the flood swept over. 5 words. A whole age closed by water, and what matters for tonight is not the impossible rains, and not the number of kings. It is the line. The scribes drew a hard border across time, and they drew it with a flood. On the far side, a lost first world of vast and perfect numbers. On our side, a recovering one, where the rains shrink toward the ordinary, spans a real king, actually lives. So the very first deep time record we possess does not merely say there was a world before. It tells us how that world ended, by water, a complete, total inundation that wiped the first order away and let a second begin on the cleaned ground. Hold that, because it is the first entry in the catalogue we are building, and of all the endings, it is the one that turns up in the most places. The Mesopotamians wrote the ending as a single line across a list, but far to the west, on the dry hills above the Aegean, a poet was about to write the same descent a different way, not as one flood, but as a slow staircase, going down step by step, age by age. Move west now and forward a little, to the stony hill country of early Greece, and to one of the first named voices in European literature, a working farmer poet called Hesiod, writing around 700 years before the Common Era, in a long poem of advice and complaint called Works and Days. Hesiod is not a mystic. He is a man with a grievance, a land dispute with his brother, and a hard view of his own times. And in the middle of his practical poem he stops to explain how things got so bad. By telling the story of the ages of humankind, he lists 5. The first he calls the Golden Age, a race of people who lived under the old god Cronus, in a time with no toil and no war, when the earth gave its fruit freely, and people did not really age, and at the end simply went as if to sleep. Then Hesiod says that race was covered over, and a second came, foolish, quarrelsome, unwilling to honour the gods, and gone before long. Then a third, the Bronze Age, a hard, warlike people with bronze houses and bronze tools and bronze hearts, who destroyed themselves by their own violence and went down nameless into the dark. So far it is a clean descent, each age worse than the last, but Hesiod does something honest here, something that tells you he is working from older material he did not invent. He breaks his own pattern. He inserts a 4th age that is actually better than the bronze one before it, the age of heroes, the demigods who fought at Thebes and Troy, more just, more noble, carried after death to the Isles of the Blessed, a bump upward in a downward stair. It does not fit a simple moral fable. It fits a poet working a real remembered tradition into a frame. And then the 5th, the present. Hesiod calls it the Iron Age, and he wishes aloud that he had been born into any age but this one, where the good suffer and the shameless prosper, and which he says the gods will one day end as well, when things have grown rotten enough. 5 ages, a long fall from gold to iron, with one rung near the bottom that does not behave, a first world soft and golden, a present world hard as the metal it is named for. It is the King List's descent again, written as a poem on the far side of a sea, by a man who never heard of Eridu. Across the ocean, with no possible contact, a third people was counting the same fall, but they counted it in suns. Cross the Atlantic west to the high volcanic basin of central Mexico. The air is thin and bright, and the ground is black rock, and the mountains on the horizon are not symbols of catastrophe. They are the genuine article, capable of burying a valley in living memory. A people here had no need to imagine the end of a world. They had geology for a neighbour. The people we know this from are the Mexica, whom we usually call the Aztecs, though the story they carried was older than they were. inherited from the valley's earlier civilizations. They wrote it down in their own language in a manuscript copied in 1558. Scholars call it the Legend of the Suns. It is part of a larger collection, the Codex Chimalpopoca, and English readers know it chiefly through the translation by John Beerhorse. So rather than summarize it, let us walk through what it counts, slowly, in a close retelling of what the text records, because every entry is doing work. The first sun was 4 Jaguar. It lasted 676 years, and its people were devoured by jaguars until that world was gone. The second sun was 4 Wind. It lasted 364 years, and it ended in a great wind that swept the world away, and its people were turned into monkeys. It lasted 312 years, and it ended in a rain of fire from the sky. The fourth sun was 4 Water. It lasted 676 years, and it ended in a flood that drowned the world, and its people became fish. And the present sun is 4 Movement. It is the 5th, and it too will end in movement, in the shaking of the earth. Read that as a list of mechanisms and look at what is in it. Beasts, wind, fire, water, and the one still to come, the earthquake. 4 endings already spent, each a different agent, each total. Now hold the 3 records we have side by side, because the shape has stopped looking like a coincidence. Sumer, a first world, ended by water. Greece, 5 ages falling from gold to iron. The bronze one self-destroyed. The present one doomed to end as well. Mexico, 4 suns destroyed by beasts, wind, fire, and flood, and a 5th waiting on the earthquake. No contact possible, and the same idea, carrying the same small catalogue of ways to die. That detail seems small. It is not. We will come back to it. But there is a 4th record, the most mathematical of them all, and the one that draws the pattern tightest. Travel east across the deserts and the mountains to the river plains of India. Here the great rhythm of life is not one flood, but the monsoon, the season when the sky opens for weeks and the world turns to water and growth. Then waits, then turns again, in a land where cycles are the texture of every single year. The most elaborate vision of cyclic time on earth took shape. It is written across the Sanskrit tradition, in the law book attributed to Manu, in the vast collections of sacred lore called the Puranas, and in its most precise mathematical form, in an astronomical treatise, the Surya Siddhanta. What they describe is the Yuga cycle. Time is not a line, it is a wheel, turning through 4 great ages, one after another, and then beginning again. The first is the golden one, the Satya Yuga, the age of truth. The texts give it an image worth keeping. Virtue in that age stands 4 square and whole, like a bull standing firm on all 4 legs. Then the wheel turns, and the next age comes, the Treta, and the bull stands now on 3 legs. Something has been lost. Then the Dvapara, virtue on 2 legs, the world harder, lives shorter, and then the 4th and last age, the one the texts say we live in now, the Kali Yuga, the age of the losing throw of the dice. The bull stands on 1 leg, barely. Truth is rare. Lives are short, and the world runs down toward an ending, after which it is remade and the golden age returns and the wheel turns once more. It is the same descent again, a first world whole and long-lived, a present age understood as the broken, late, diminished tale of something greater. The king lists shrinking reigns, Hesiod's fall from gold to iron, written here as a turning wheel. And then there is the arithmetic, which is where it stops being only a shape. The texts give each age a length, falling in the proportion 4, 3, 2, 1. The last age, the Kali, is set at 432,000 years, and that exact figure, 432,000, turns up again in a Babylonian priest's reckoning of the kings before the flood, written on the far side of a continent. Sober scholars have long noticed the match. None has comfortably explained it. The same number, two traditions, no road between them, or so it seems. Whose number it was first, and how it could be in both places at all, is the thread we have to pull next, and we pull it gently, because it has snapped in careless hands many times before. Let me lay the inventory out plainly, because it is the heart of the whole night, and it is more precise than people expect. Set the 4 records side by side and read only the ways each world is said to die. From Sumer, the flood, total water. From the legend of the suns, 4 spent endings, beasts, wind, fire and water, with earthquakes still to come. From Hesiod, the violence of the bronze men turning on themselves, and a present age, the gods will end in their own time, and running underneath the Indian wheel and the Greek stare alike, the quieter ending, not a single catastrophe, but a slow cooling, a long winding down, virtue losing a leg at a time until almost nothing stands. Now count the agents, water, fire, wind, the turning of beasts or of people upon the living, and cold, the slow ice of decline, the world simply running out of warmth and truth. 5 or 6 ways to lose a world. And that is, very nearly, the entire list. No culture in this set ends a world by something genuinely alien. They reach, every time, for the same small handful of forces. And it is not only the agents that match, it is the grammar. In every one of these traditions, the first world is the soft one. Golden, watered, long-lived, virtue standing on all 4 legs, and the descent runs toward hardness, toward iron, toward shorter lives and harsher endings, toward an age the people telling it always believe is the worst and the last. They never place themselves in the golden age. They place themselves near the bottom of the stair, looking up at a brightness they have lost. That is a remarkable agreement to find on 4 separate islands of human thought, the same short menu of catastrophes, in roughly the same descending order, told by people who could not have shown each other their notes. The orthodox reading, which we will give its full and fair hearing later, says this is no mystery at all. The menu is short because the world's menu is short. There are only so many ways a real disaster can come, and the human mind, anywhere, will catalogue the same few. That is a strong answer, and a calm one. But hold the other possibility beside it, just as quietly, that the agreement is this exact because somewhere far enough back it was once a single account, one telling of how worlds end, carried out of some shared deep past, and split into 4 streams that kept the bones even as the languages changed. Either way, the question is the same. Why these endings, and why this order? We turn to that now. So here is where we are, lying in the dark with 4 records spread out before us, all carrying the same short list of ways a world dies. The easy move now is to declare that coincidence is impossible and reach for the drowned. Super-civilization. One lost global culture that supposedly seeded all the others with the memory of the worlds. Before, it is an absorbing story. It is also, on the evidence we actually hold, almost certainly not true. There is no sunken city with libraries. If there were one global wreck, we would have found a single brick of it by now, and across 2 centuries of digging the whole planet over, we have not. But the easy move in the other direction is just as wrong, to wave the whole pattern away as nothing, because 4 peoples landing on the same catalogue of catastrophe, in the same descending order, is a real thing that deserves a real explanation, not a shrug. The honest middle is more interesting than either edge, and it has 2 layers. The first layer is the world itself. Consider what these four peoples truly shared, not contact. The same planet. Each of them lived somewhere that periodically tried to end them, and each was ended by one of the very forces on the list. Mesopotamia drowned. The Tigris and Euphrates could rise without warning and take a city in a night, and there are real flood layers in the dirt to prove it. India lived and died by a monsoon that could fail or could overwhelm. Mexico sat on a floor of earthquakes, under volcanoes that rained fire and ash. Greece knew drought, knew fire, knew the wind that strips a hillside bare. The menu of endings is short because the planet's menu is short. Water, fire, wind, cold, and the violence of the hungry. That is most of how a real world has ever actually fallen. The second layer is the human mind doing honest arithmetic on its own grief. If your world has partly ended before, and every one of these peoples had buried a drowned town, a failed harvest, a city under ash, then it is no leap to suppose it has ended completely before, and will again. The cyclic vision is not necessarily a memory of one lost civilization. It may be something deeper and truer, the most natural inference, a thinking, mourning species ever drew. Things end, things have ended. So things ended before us, and will end after us. That is not mysticism, that is wisdom, reached 4 times over on 4 islands of thought, and modern science, it turns out, has now confirmed the sober bones of it, even the unsettling part where several worlds end at once. Set the sacred numbers down for a moment, and the suns, and the turning wheel, and ask the plainest version of the ancient claim, stripped of every god. Do whole human worlds, with their cities and harvests and kings rise, last a while, and end together in a rhythm? The records said yes in 4 languages, and in the last decades the evidence has come back saying yes as well, in the language of cave stone and lake mud. The clearest case sits about 4,200 years ago. Across a vast band of the world, in the same window, the climate turned hard and dry. The records of it are written in lake sediments, in old soils, and above all, in the chemistry of cave formations. Stalagmites grow faster in wet years and slower in dry ones, and so they keep a rain gouge of the deep past. They show a sudden, severe, long-lasting drought. And in that same window, the first great civilizations on earth went into crisis at once. In Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire fell apart. It was the world's first true empire, and it came undone. The archaeologist Harvey Weiss and his colleagues, digging at Tel Leilan in Syria, found a thriving city buried under a deep layer of wind-blown dust. They published the link to that drought in the journal Science in 1993. In Egypt, the old kingdom of the pyramid builders fragmented into famine and chaos in the same span. In the Indus Valley, the great planned brick cities began their long decline. And then the detail that would have stopped an ancient scribe cold. In the Yangtze Basin of China, a sophisticated culture called Liangzhu collapsed at almost exactly the same time. This was a society with a 5,000-year-old water system, sometimes called the Venice of the Stone Age. In 2021, a team including the geologist Christoph Sputtel of the University of Innsbruck dated its fall to roughly 4,300 years ago. They read it in cave stalagmites and published it in Science Advances. Its world did not end in drought, though. It ended in the opposite, in years of catastrophic monsoon flooding, water again. So 4 early worlds on a span of continents faltered or fell inside a few centuries of one another, struck by different faces of the same shifting climate. Drought here, flood there, not a god's anger, a shift in the rhythm of rain. The ancients said worlds end together, in cycles. They were not measuring the sky correctly, but the sky was doing the thing they said it did. Coincidence that the people who counted the endings were right about the endings. or a memory kept in myth because there was no other vessel to keep it in? So, after all of it, the flood that drew the first line, the 5 ages, the 4 suns, the turning wheel, the cave in China, what are we actually left holding? The orthodox reading is clean, and it is mostly right, and a careful person should keep it. It says the catalogue of endings is short because the world's catalogue is short. There really are only so many ways a disaster comes, and any people anywhere, given floods and fires and failing rains, will write down the same few. It says the descending shape gold to iron, 4 legs to 1, is the natural voice of every generation that believes the past was better. It says the shared number is Babylonian arithmetic that travelled the trade roads, and the drowned super-civilization is a fantasy with no brick to its name. Every one of those statements is defensible. None of them requires a single thing we cannot prove. But notice what the safe reading does not quite dissolve. It does not dissolve the fact that the core claim is simply true, that worlds do end, in clusters on a clock we can now read in cave stone, and it does not fully explain why the agreement is so specific. Worlds do not merely end, they end by this exact short list, in this exact descending order, on continents with no road between them. A shared inventory, kept in order, is a harder thing to set aside, and it has never been comfortably explained away. And here is the gentlest part, the part worth carrying into sleep. The scholar of religion Mircea Eliade spent his life on exactly this pattern. In a book first published in 1949, The Myth of the Eternal Return, he reached a conclusion the loud versions always miss. For the people who told these stories, the cycle of endings was never a prophecy of doom. It was the opposite. It was a promise of renewal. A world ends so that a world can begin, clean, on the washed ground. The flood is not only the death of the first age, it is the birth of the second. The wheel does not only fall, it comes round. We do not have to decide tonight which reading is true. The prism rests in its case in Oxford, the sunstone in Mexico City, the palm leaves in their libraries, the cave layers in their drawers, all of them quiet. 4 peoples looked at their own world and refused to believe it was the first, and counted the worlds before by the same handful of endings, and were right about the one part they could not have guessed, that worlds really do end and begin again. Next week we stay with the one ending that turns up in more records than any other, the flood, and the question of why nearly every people on earth remembers the same drowned world. If you would like that story to find you, leave the channel on. For now let the suns set one after another, and the wheel slow, and the water go still. There is an idea so old that 3 peoples who never met each other, on 3 different continents, wrote it down on their own. The idea is this, that ours is not the first world, only the latest one. Not a legend told once and forgotten. A claim that turns up again and again, in clay, in palm leaf, in carved stone, measurable, datable, real. In 1923, a scholar at Oxford named Stephen Langdon laid out a 4-sided clay prism, no taller than a forearm, and read the oldest list of kings on earth. The list did not begin with the first king. It began before a great flood, with rulers, it said, had reigned for tens of thousands of years each, in cities that drown. Half a world away, in the sacred books of India, the same shape appears, 4 ages turning down like a wheel, each shorter and harder than the last. And across the ocean, in the highlands of Mexico, a people carved a great stone sun and said, plainly, that the sun above us is the 5th, that 4 worlds came before, and 4 times the world had ended. So who counted these worlds before ours? Why did such different people land on the same idea? And what, if anything, were they actually remembering? Wherever you are listening from tonight, a quiet house in the suburbs, a flat with the city humming below, a small room where the lamp is already low, settle in. Tonight we follow the king list, the wheel of ages, and the 5 suns, and we ask, gently, what number the ancient records were really counting. Start with the thing you already half believe. Somewhere in the back of almost everyone's mind sits a quiet suspicion that history, the version we were taught, starts too late, that something came before the beginning we were given. We rarely say it out loud. It sounds like the start of a story that ends badly, with crystals and lost continents and people selling you something, so we set the feeling down and we look away. But the feeling is older than any of those stories. It is older than the word history itself. The peoples who first invented writing did not think they were standing at the dawn of time. They thought they were standing in the wreckage of something. Their oldest documents do not open with creation and then march forward into the present. They open by looking backward, over a wall, at worlds that had already fallen. This is the part the standard account leads you to expect least. We tend to imagine ancient people as the children of the human story, wide-eyed, early, naive at the beginning of everything. But the scribes of Mesopotamia, sitting in their mud-brick cities 4,500 years ago, did not feel early. They believed they were the inheritors of a much older world that the gods had already wiped. They felt late, away once in water. And they were not the only ones who felt this way. If it were only the Sumerians, we could explain it easily, but the same instinct surfaces in places that had no contact with Mesopotamia and no contact. One culture, one flood, one set of myths with each other. In the volcanic highlands of central Mexico, in the sky lore of the Mediterranean, different languages, different gods, different centuries, and the same underlying shape. This world is not the first. It is one in a series. There were others. They ended. Tonight we are going to do something careful with that shape. We are not going to chase lost continents. We are not going to claim a hidden super-civilization with technology like ours. That is the easy story, and the easy story is almost always wrong. Instead, we are going to read the real records. The ones you can find in real museums, translated by real scholars with real catalogue numbers and real dates of publication. We are going to separate the part that is genuinely written down from the part that people only. We are going to ask what they actually say in their own words before anyone improved them. Wish were written down. We are going to turn to the one branch of modern science that has quietly confirmed the sober, and then, near the end, core of the whole idea. Not the fantasy version. That worlds, real human worlds, with cities and kings and harvests, do, in fact, rise, and last a while, and then end, over and over. But to feel why the ancient scribes counted backward, we have to start where their counting started, with a flood and a list of impossible kings. Picture a clay object, the size of a thick paperback book, stood on its end. It has 4 flat sides. Down each side run 2 narrow columns of wedge-shaped writing, pressed into the clay when it was soft, then baked hard. There is a hole bored straight through the middle, top to bottom, as though it was once meant to turn on a spindle. It is a little over 20 centimetres tall. You really could hold it in one hand. It sits today in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It came out of the ground at a site called Larsa in southern Iraq in 1922, and reached Oxford the following year, where the scholar Stephen Langdon published its text, and it carries the most complete copy we have of a document scholars call the Sumerian King. It is usually called the Weld Blundell Prism. The list is, on its surface, a dry thing, a roster of kings and cities and the number of years each king is said to have ruled, an administrator's document, the kind of record a kingdom keeps to prove it has the right to exist. But read the very first line and the floor drops away. When kingship had descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. That is how it opens. Not the first king was born, not our people came down from the hills, but kingship descended from the sky, and the first place it rested was a city called Eridu, in the marshes near the Persian Gulf. Eridu is a real place. You can walk its mound today. Excavators have dug down through layer upon layer of temples, all the way down to the earliest shrine on virgin soil, one of the oldest sacred sites yet, each built on the ruins of the last found anywhere on earth. And then come the rains. The first king of Eridu, a figure named Alulim, is credited with ruling for 28,800 years, his successor for 36,000. The list moves on city to city. Eridu, then Bad Tibera, then Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, naming 8 kings in all, before the flood. Their reigns, added together, come to 241,200 years. 250,000 years. 8 men, before the flood. Then the list says one short, devastating sentence. Then the flood swept over. And after the flood, the numbers change. Kingship descends from heaven a second time. New cities take it up. And the reigns begin to shrink, first to thousands of years, then to hundreds. As the list comes down toward kings we can actually verify in other records, to the ordinary human spans of 20 and 30 years, that a real reign actually lasts. So the king list is doing something stranger than listing kings. It is drawing a line across time. On one side of the line, a lost world of impossibly long reigns, ended by water. On our side, a recovering world, where lifetimes slowly become real. The obvious question is the one the scribes never answer. Why those numbers? We turn to that next. The temptation when you first meet the king list's numbers is to do one of two things: to believe them literally, to imagine actual men ruling for 28,000 years, or to laugh them off as nonsense, the make-believe of people who could not count. Both reactions miss the more interesting question, which is not whether the numbers are true, it is why they are the numbers they are. Because they are not random. The Sumerians, and the Babylonians after them, did not count the way we do, in tens. They counted in 60s. This is the sexagesimal system, and it is one of the most consequential inventions in human history. It is why an hour has 60 minutes, why a minute has 60 seconds, why a circle has 360 degrees. When you check the time tonight, you are using a Sumerian base, 4,500 years old, still running. In that system, the important large unit was the Sarule, a count of 3,600, 60/60s, and the reigns in the king list are not arbitrary spans. They are built from Sars. Alulim's 28,800 years is exactly 8 Sars. The reigns are multiples of 3,600 and of 600, fitted together like weights on a scale. So the numbers are not a fantasy about biology. They are a structure, a piece of sacred arithmetic. They were placing him inside a numerical architecture that meant something to them, a way of... The scribes were not claiming a man lived 280 centuries, saying this belongs to the order before the flood, the order of vast and perfect numbers, not the broken arithmetic of our own short lives. Here is the detail the standard reading does not always pause on. And their multiples keeps reappearing in the deep time reckonings of other cultures that had, That same family of numbers, 60, 3,600, no contact with Sumer at all, the number 360, the number 12, and one number above all, which we will meet in full a little later tonight, that surfaces in a Babylonian priest's account of the kings before the flood, and then again, impossibly, in the sacred chronology of India, the same figure. Two cultures, no road between them. We will hold that coincidence at arm's length for now. It may mean something. It may mean nothing more than that the human mind, given 60 as a base, tends to build the same large round numbers, the way two people given the same set of bricks tend to build similar walls. But the King list has already told us something real, whatever the numbers mean. It has told us that the first people to write history believed there was a world before theirs, a world of a different order, ended by a flood separated from their own by a hard line. They were not at the beginning. They were after an ending. And almost 5,000 kilometres to the east, in a wholly different civilization, someone was drawing the very same line, but turning it into a wheel. Travel east in your mind, across the deserts and the mountains, to the river plains of northern India. The great rhythm of life is not the river flood alone, but the monsoon, the season when the sky, the light is different here, heavier, wetter, green, where Mesopotamia was ochre, opens, and the rain comes in sheets for weeks, and the whole world turns to water and growth, and then dries and waits, and turns again. They are the texture of every single year. The rains come, the rains go, the rains come again. It is in this world that one of humanity's most elaborate visions of cyclic time took shape. It is written across the great Sanskrit texts, in the law book attributed to Manu, in the vast collections of sacred law called the Puranas, and, in its most precise mathematical form, a work on the motions of the heavens whose surviving form dates to roughly the early medieval, in an astronomical treatise known as the Surya Siddhanta, centuries, but whose roots reach back much further. These texts describe what is called the Yuga cycle. The idea is this: time is not a line that runs from a beginning to an end. It is a wheel. The world passes through 4 great ages, one after another, called the Yugas, and then the wheel comes round, and they begin again. The first age is the golden one. The texts call it the Krita, or the Satya Yuga, the age of truth. In it, the texts say, virtue stands foursquare and whole, like a bull standing on all 4 legs. People live long, the harvest is easy. There is no need for law because no one breaks it. Then the wheel turns, and the second age comes, the Treta. Virtue stands now on 3 legs. Something has been lost. Then the third age, the Dvapara, virtue on 2 legs, the world harder again, lifespans shorter, conflict ordinary. And then the fourth and final age, the one the texts say we are living in now. They call it the Kali Yuga, the age of the losing throw of the dice, the dark age. Virtue stands on 1 leg barely. Lives are short, truth is rare. The world runs down toward an ending, after which it will be remade, and the golden age will return, and the wheel will turn once more. Look at the shape of it. A first world, whole and long-lived, a series of worsening ages, lifespans shrinking from the vast to the brief, a present age understood as the broken, late, diminished end of a much greater sequence. It is the same shape as the King list. The long reigns at the start, the line between the perfect old order and our own diminished one. Sumer wrote it as a list with a flood across the middle. India wrote it as a turning wheel. And when you do the arithmetic of that wheel, When you ask exactly how many years each age is said to last, a number comes out that should not be there. Here is the arithmetic, slowly, because it is the heart of the whole night. The Sanskrit texts give each yuga a length in years. The dark age we are said to live in now, the Kali Yuga, is the shortest of the four. Its length is given as 432,000 years. The age before it, the Dvapara, is twice as long. The age before that, the Treta, 3 times as long. And the Golden Age at the start, the Krita, 4 times as long. So the 4 ages run in the proportion 4, 3, 2, 1. A descending staircase of time. Add the 4 together, and you get one full turn of the wheel. The texts call it a Mahayuga, a great age. Its length is 4,320,000 years, which is simply the Kali figure 432,000 multiplied by 10. So the entire architecture of Hindu cyclic time is built on a single foundation number, 432,000. Now hold that number in your mind and travel back to Mesopotamia. With its 8 kings before the flood, and its total of 241,000, we met the king list, years. But the king list is not the only Mesopotamian account of the kings before the flood. Centuries later, a Babylonian priest named Berossus, writing in Greek for the Hellenistic world, set down his own version of that lost age. In his account, the kings before the flood number not 8, but 10. And the total of their reigns is not 241,000 years. It is 432,000. The same number, the age of the world before the flood in Babylon, and the length of the dark age of the world in India, 2 civilizations, 2 languages, 2 religions, no shared border, no shared scripture, and a number that matches to the digit. Sit with that for a moment. What are the odds that 2 peoples, this far apart, counting the worlds before their own, would both arrive at 432,000? I want to leave that question open in the dark for a little while, and the people who tell you they know for certain are usually the ones selling because the honest answer is that we do not fully know Lost Continent story. What we can say is this: the number is real. It is in Berossus, preserved through later writers. It is in the Surya Siddhanta and the Puranas, written down on the far side of a continent. The match is not invented by modern mystics. It was noticed by sober scholars long ago, and it has never been comfortably explained away. It is the possibility that the number itself was travelling past hand to hand along the... There is a third possibility, between coincidence and a lost super-race. Trade roads that already connected Babylon and India, a piece of sacred arithmetic shared the way recipes and gods and constellations were shared, to a people who could not possibly have shared anything with either, and who counted the... We will come back to that gentler explanation. But first we cross an ocean, worlds anyway. Cross the Atlantic now, west, to the high volcanic basin of central Mexico. This is a different Earth again. The air is thin and bright at altitude. The ground is black volcanic rock. Snow-capped cones stand on the horizon. And the volcanoes here are not metaphors for catastrophe. They are catastrophe, real and remembered, capable of burying a valley in ash within living memory. A people who lived here had no need to imagine the end of a world. They had geology for a neighbour. The people we know best from this basin are the Aztecs, or more properly, the Mexica, who built their island capital where Mexico City now stands, inherited from the civilizations that came before them in the same valley, and it told thee. But the cosmology they carried was older than they were. Same story we have been following all night. That ours is not the first world. The Mexica called the worlds suns. Each sun was an age, a creation, a complete world with its own people and its own kind of life. And the teaching, set down in a 16th century Nahuatl manuscript known as the Legend of the Suns, was that 4 suns had already existed and been destroyed before the one that lights us now. Each previous sun ended in its own kind of catastrophe. The first sun, they said, was destroyed when jaguars came and devoured its people. The second sun ended in wind, a great hurricane that swept the world away, and its people, the texts say, were turned into monkeys scattered into the trees. The third sun ended in fire, a rain of fire from the sky. The fourth sun ended in water, a flood that drowned the world, and its people became fish. 4 worlds, 4 endings, jaguars, wind, fire, and flood. And the present world, the one we are in, is the 5th sun. The Mexica called it Nahui Olin, 4 movement. And they believed it too would end, not in jaguars or wind or fire or water, but in movement, in earthquakes. The very ground would shake the 5th world apart, as it had shaken their valley before. This is the great stone many people have seen without knowing what they were looking at, the Aztec Sun Stone. The massive carved disc now in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City is in part a map of exactly this. At its centre, the face of the present sun. Around it, 4 panels, marking the 4 suns that came before, the 4 worlds that already ended. Now stand back and hold all 3 together. Sumer, a lost world before the flood, then ours. India, 4 ages turning down toward our diminished present. Mexico, 4 suns destroyed and ours the 5th. 3 peoples who never met. 3 records that all say the same impossible thing. This is not the first world. There were others. Count them. The numbers differ. 8 kings, 4 ages, 5 suns. But the shape is identical, and it is the shape, more than any single number, that we have to explain. So here is where we are, lying in the dark with 3 civilizations laid out before us. The lazy thing to do now is to shout coincidence is impossible and reach for the lost. Super-civilization, the one global culture, drowned and forgotten, that supposedly seeded all the others with the memory of the worlds before. It is a thrilling story. It is also, on the evidence we actually have, almost certainly not true. There is no drowned city with libraries. There is no global wreck. If there were, we would have found a single brick of it by now, and we have not. But the lazy thing in the other direction is just as wrong. To say that 3 peoples independently inventing the same shape of time means absolutely to wave the whole pattern away as nothing, because that is a remarkable thing in itself, and it deserves a real explanation, not a shrug. The honest middle is more interesting than either extreme. Consider what these 3 peoples actually had in common. Not contact, not a shared ancestor civilization, something simpler and far more powerful. They had the same planet, the same sky, the same human memory. Mesopotamia flooded. The Tigris and Euphrates could rise without warning and drown a seasons. Every one of these cultures lived somewhere that periodically tried to end them. Work, and a city's people in a night. India lived and died by a monsoon that could fail. Mexico sat among volcanoes and on a floor of earthquakes. Each of them had, in their real history, watched a piece of their world destroyed and then rebuilt. Each of them buried generations who remembered a worse year, a lost town, a vanished way of life. If your world has ended before, even partly, even locally, it is not elite to suppose it has ended completely before, and will again. It is the most natural inference a thinking person could draw. The cyclic vision is not necessarily a memory of one specific lost civilization. It may be something deeper and truer. It may be the human mind doing honest arithmetic on its own experience. Things end. Things have ended. Therefore things ended before us, and will end after us. That is not mysticism. That is wisdom, the way 3 separate peoples all worked out that a year has roughly 300. And it is the kind of wisdom 3 separate peoples could reach on their own 65 days, because the sky told all of them the same thing. But it leaves the sharpest part unexplained, the shape 3 peoples could reach alone, but that one specific number, 432,000, sitting in both A, the shape is human, Babylonian text and an Indian one. A shape is an idea. A number that exact is a fingerprint. Ideas arise everywhere. Fingerprints have to be carried. So before we ask what modern science says about world's ending, we have to follow that number, because the number, unlike the shape, may actually have travelled, and the road it travelled may not be the one you expect. The man who gives us the clearest version of the number was not a mystic. He was a priest and a historian, and he was trying, in his own way, to be accurate. His name was Berossus. He lived in Babylon in the 3rd century before the Common Era, in the Greek-speaking world that Alexander's conquests had opened up. He was a priest of the god Marduk, with access to temple archives going back centuries, and he set out to explain his own ancient civilization to the Greeks, in their language, in a work called the Babyloniaca. The book itself is lost, but other writers quoted it, and through their quotations we still have its bones. And in those bones is the list of kings before the flood. 10 of them in Berossus. In total, for 120 Saroi, 120 of those Babylonian 6060s, each worth 3,600 years. 120 times 3,600, 432,000 years. So the number is built, transparently, out of the Sumerian counting system. It is SARS stacked up, it is sexagesimal arithmetic taken to a grand scale. It is, in other words, native to Mesopotamia. It grew there, out of base 60, the way an oak grows out of an acorn. Now here is the quiet thread that may connect the 2 ends of the world. By the time Berossus was writing, Babylon and India were not strangers. The trade roads were open. Goods, gods, and knowledge moved along them. Babylonian astronomy in particular was the most advanced in the world, and it travelled. Its mathematical methods turn up later, demonstrably, in Greek and in Indian astronomy alike. The base 60 system itself spread along these routes. It is why Indian astronomers, too, divided the circle and measured the heavens in ways that echo Mesopotamia. Most defensible explanation for the shared 432,000 is not a lost, so the gentlest civilization at all. It is a shared toolkit, a grand sacred number, born from Babylonian base 60. And woven into a Yuga system that was being formalized in its mathematical detail, inexactly carried east along the same roads that carried everything else, the era when that exchange was richest. That is the careful claim. The number may have travelled hand to hand, the way a song travels. It does not require anyone from before the flood. It only requires merchants and priests, and the long, patient conversation between civilizations that we know was happening. There is a bolder claim, and we should name it before we set it down. In 1969, 2 historians of science, Giorgio de Santillana of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Hertha von Dechend, published a difficult, sprawling book called Hamlet's Mill. In it they argued that numbers like these encode something astronomical, a vast, slow wobble of the earth. What that wobble is, and whether the ancients truly measured it, is the next thread, and it is the one we have to handle with the most care of all. The wobble is real. Let me start with the part that is solid, before we get anywhere near the speculation. The Earth does not spin like a perfect top. It wobbles, very slowly, the way a spinning top wobbles as it loses speed, except the Earth is not slowing. It is simply leaning and turning its lean in a great slow circle. This is the precession of the equinoxes. Because of it, the point in the sky that the North Pole points to changes over the centuries. The pole star of the ancient Egyptians was not our pole star. In thousands of years it will not be ours either. One full circle of this wobble takes a long time, about 25,770 years. Astronomers sometimes call it the Great Year. It is a genuine, measurable feature of how our planet moves, confirmed to high precision by modern observation. None of that is in dispute. What is in dispute, and here we step carefully, is whether the ancients knew it, and whether they hid it inside their sacred numbers. This was the thesis of Hamlet's Mill. De Santillana and von der Hend argued that myths the world over, stories of grinding mills, of churning seas, of a cosmic order that slips, were a kind of code, and that the numbers buried in them, including 432,000, were chosen because they divided neatly into the rhythms of precession. The number in this reading is not about kings or ages at all. It is a way of writing down the slow turning of the sky, disguised as a story, so that it would survive being told for 10,000 years. It is a beautiful idea. I want to be honest with you about how beautiful it is, and also about how little it is accepted. Most historians of science do not buy it. The criticisms are serious and they are fair. The numbers can be made to fit precession only by choosing which numbers to use and which to. The same flexibility that lets 432,000 fit the sky would let, and you deserve to hear them named before the idea is offered to you, not after. Ignore. Almost any large round number fits something, and there is no surviving ancient text that says, plainly this number means the wobble of the heavens. The connection is inferred by modern authors, not stated by ancient ones. So we leave it in the column where it honestly belongs, possible, suggestive, unproven, and whose deepest meaning we cannot read with confidence, because the people who wrote it down, a number that is undeniably real, undeniably shared, did not leave us the key, and may not have had one. This is the discipline the whole subject demands, not to flinch from the genuine mystery, and not to inflate it into a certainty it cannot bear. But step back from the number now, all the way back. Forget for a moment whether anyone encoded the sky. Ask the plainer question. Were the ancients right about the basic thing, that worlds end in cycles? On that, finally, modern science has a clear and sober answer, and it is yes. Set the sacred numbers down. Let the kings and the ages and the suns rest for a while, and ask the simplest version of the ancient claim, the one stripped of all arithmetic. Do human worlds end? Not metaphorically. Really. Do whole civilizations, with cities, harvests, writing, kings, rise, last a while and then collapse, leaving ruins for later people to wonder at? The ancients said yes insistently, in 3 languages, and on this the evidence is overwhelming, and it is not mystical in the slightest. It is dirt and bone and the chemistry of old mud. Consider one event, because it is the best documented of all. 200 years ago, roughly 2200 years before the Common Era, around 4000 happened to the climate across a huge swath of the world at once. The records of it are written in lake sediments, in cave formations, in ancient soils, in the dust blown across the Near East and trapped in the seabed. They tell of a sharp, severe, long-lasting drought, less rain, year after year, for generations. And in that same window, 3 of the first great civilizations on Earth went into crisis at the same time. In Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire, the world's first true empire, the one that had united the cities under a single crown, fell apart. Its northern cities were abandoned, the plains emptied. In Egypt, the age of the great pyramid builders, the Old Kingdom, fragmented into chaos and famine. Texts from the period describe the unthinkable. The great planned cities of one of the most sophisticated early civilizations began ere long. The social order turned upside down, the river failing. And in the Indus Valley, decline. 3 worlds, stressed, broken, or ended, in the same century, by something in the sky, not a god's anger, but a shift in rainfall. It is so well established that geologists have made it a formal boundary in the history of this is not fringe science, planet. We will come to exactly how shortly, because it is one of the quiet astonishments of this whole story. But feel first what it does to the ancient claim. The scribes of Sumer believed a world had ended before theirs. They were right, not about the dates, not about the impossible rains, but about the bedrock fact. Worlds do end. Building their flawless brick cities, were themselves living in the wreckage of climate catastrophe, whether or not they knew it. The Mexica, watching their volcanoes, knew that the ground could end a world, because the ground had done it before. The cyclic vision was not a fantasy. It was a true generalization, drawn from a real and brutal pattern that the earth runs whether or not anyone is counting. The ancients got the rhythm right. They only dressed it in numbers too large, and gods too many, and a precision they could not actually have. Built their own worlds directly on top of the ruins of the ones that had ended, and did not. And the strangest proof of how right they were is this: later peoples, again and again, always know it. There is a particular feeling that runs through the deep human past, and once you notice it, you find it everywhere. It is a feeling of standing in front of something built by people you cannot name, who were gone before your own grandparents were born. The ancients lived with that feeling constantly. We tend to forget that to an ancient person, other things were already ancient. When the Aztecs came into the Valley of Mexico, they found a vast, silent, ruined city already standing there. Pyramids larger than anything they could build, a place so old and so abandoned that they did not know who had made it or what its builders had. They named it Teotihuacan, the place where the gods were made, and they wove it into their wide avenues empty, called themselves Story of the Suns, because what else do you do with a dead world you have inherited? You make it part of the count. The same thing happened in Mesopotamia, the cities the king list names as the seats of kingship before the flood. Eridu, Shuruppak, were to the later Babylonians already unimaginably old. Eridu's ruins were ancient ruins in antiquity. Pilgrims went there to touch a past that was already lost to them. When Berossus wrote his 10 Kings, he was not inventing a fantasy from nothing. He was looking back at genuinely old places, abandoned tells already half-eaten by the desert, and reaching for a frame large enough to hold their age, 250,000 years, 432,000, numbers that meant simply, older than we can hold in the mind. This is the part the careful reading restores to the ancient records. They were not lying, and they were not channeling a lost super-race. They were doing what we do when we stand in a ruin. They were trying to measure a depth of time they could feel but not count. And they felt it accurately. The depth was real. Beneath every ancient city we have ever excavated lie older cities. Beneath the villages lie the long, deep time ages of people who hunted and buried their dead. Beneath the earliest writing lie thousands of years of villages that left no words, watched the same stars, for a span so vast it dwarfs all of recorded history put together. The ancients were standing, exactly as they said, in the wreckage of older worlds. They simply could not see how far down the wreckage went. Neither, until very recently, could we. So when a Sumerian scribe wrote that kingship had descended from heaven, and the first world had, drowned, he was not entirely wrong, and he was not entirely right. He was a man standing on an old mound at dusk, and putting a number to it because a number was the only honest way he had to say this is older, feeling the weight of everyone who had come before. Then I can say, the question is how a feeling like that survives, across thousands of years, across an ocean, into 3 separate records. And the answer is gentler and more human than any conspiracy. How does a true thing survive for 10,000 years without writing? We are so dependent on the written word that we forget the answer the human species used for almost its entire existence. The answer is the story told aloud at night by someone who loves you to someone who will tell it again. This is the part of the cyclic vision that needs no mystery at all, and it may be the most moving part of the whole night. Imagine a real flood on a real river 4 or 5 or 6,000 years before the Common Era, not a global deluge, the kind the Mesopotamian plain genuinely produced. There are flood layers in the dirt at a catastrophic local flood, old cities, real silt deposits from real disasters that drowned real towns. Imagine the handful of people who survived it. They saw world end, their parents' world, their God's city, their whole order of things gone under the water in a season. What do survivors do? They tell their children. Before the flood, things were different. Before the flood, the old kings ruled, and the cities stood, and the world was greater than it is now. And the children tell their children, and with each retelling the kings grow a little older, the world before grows a little grander. The numbers swell because that is what awe does to a number passed down the generations. A real flood becomes the flood. Real lost towns become a lost golden age. This is not falsehood. It is memory doing what memory does, keeping the emotional truth while the details drift. The emotional truth was rock solid. A world really had ended. People really had survived into a diminished after time. The grandeur of the before was real grief, honestly felt. Now do the same thing in a monsoon valley, where the rains fail and a way of life dies, and the elders say the golden age is behind us. We live in the dark age now. Do it in a volcanic highland, where the mountain buries a world, and the survivors say this is the 5th sun. 4 came before, and they all ended. 3 peoples. 3 real catastrophes. Not a shared memory of one event, a shared way of carrying the universal experience of loss. The number 432,000 may well have travelled the trade roads, as we have seen, but the shape, the lost first world, the diminished present, the certainty that worlds end, that did not need to travel at all. It grows wherever people survive a disaster and love their children enough to warn them. It is the oldest inheritance there is. And this is why the ancient records still reach us at 3 in the morning, across all that distance, and feel like they're about us. Because they are. They're not a code about the sky. They are the human voice, doing the one thing it has always done in the dark, passing on what it learned, so the next world will be ready. The question they leave us with is the only one that matters. What number are we? Turn the lens around now gently and point it at us. For the whole of this story we have been the audience, the safe, present people, looking back at the lost worlds of others, the Sumerians' drowned cities, the Yuga's golden age, the 4 dead suns, comfortable on this side of the glass, but every one of those vanished worlds once stood exactly where we stand now. Lit, certain of itself, looking back at its own ruins and feeling, as we feel, that it was the real one, the lasting one, the world that would not end. Do not think I live in a civilization that will collapse within a few generations and become the Akkadian, walking the streets of the First Empire, cautionary layer of dust. He thought what we think. This is permanent. This is how things are. The Messica, standing before their great calendar stone, knew better. They had built into the very centre of their cosmology the knowledge that their own sun, the fifth, would also end. They counted themselves into the series. They did not pretend to be the exception. Nahui Olin, the present world, sat on the stone as one age among five, not above them. There is a strange humility in that, and a strange courage. To carve, at the heart of your civilization, we too are temporary. We are the latest world, not the last one. It is the opposite of how we live. We have largely stopped counting ourselves at all. We tell a story of history that runs from the cave to us, and then simply stops with us, as though the line ends here and the future is just more of the present, forever. The ancient records say quietly that no world has ever been the last one. This is not doom. I want to be careful because it would be easy to make this frightening, and fear is not what the records offer. The Meshika did not know the year the fifth sun would end, and they did not pretend to. The Yuga texts deal in hundreds of thousands of years. None of these traditions is a countdown. They are something calmer and deeper. They are a frame, a way of standing inside your own world with your eyes open, knowing it is one in a long line, owing a debt to the worlds that ended to make yours possible, and owing something in turn to the worlds that will come after. That is what it means to count yourself. Not to live in fear of the ending, but to live as one chapter in a story far longer than your chapter, the 7th perhaps, or the 70th, or the 7,000. The count was never the point. The point was the humility of taking your place in the series. The ancients arrived at that humility through grief and through myth. We can arrive at it through evidence, because modern science in the last few decades has done something the old scribes would have understood instantly. It has measured the lifespan of a world. Here is the ancient claim, in one plain sentence, strict of every god and every impossible number: civilizations are not permanent. They rise, they last a while, and they end in a rhythm. That is the testable core, and in the last 40 years, 2 strands of modern science have tested it, and both came back with the same answer the scribes gave. Take the climate strand first. In 1993, a team led by the Yale archaeologist Harvey Weiss published a study in the journal Science. They had been digging at a site called Tel Leian in the dry plains of northern Syria, and they found something stark in the soil. At the level corresponding to the fall of the Akkadian Empire, the dirt changed. Above the thriving city came a layer of wind-blown dust, fine, sterile, deep, and then abandonment. The land had dried hard and fast, and the empire had emptied out. They linked it to a sudden, severe, centuries-long drought across the whole region around 4,200 years ago. That same drought, as we have seen, struck Egypt and the Indus in the same window. The International Commission on Stratigraphy, the body that formally defines the chapters of, and in 2018, Earth's history, did something quietly extraordinary. They made that drought a boundary. They divided the most recent age of the planet, the Holocene, into parts, and they marked the start of its latest part, which they named the Megalayan, at the 4.2 Kaloya event. The Golden Spike is a stalagmite in a cave in Meghalaya in India, whose chemistry records the drought. Sit with what that means. The collapse the Akkadians lived through, the ending of their world, is now, formally, the beginning of a chapter in the history of the entire planet. We are, by the official reckoning of geology, living in the age that began when the first empire fell. The ancients said a world ended and ours began on its ruins. The stratigraphers, with their cave chemistry, agreed and dated it. Then take the second strand. In 2019, the Cambridge researcher Luke Kemp, working at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, did something almost shockingly simple. He gathered the great civilizations of the ancient world, Sumer, Egypt, the empires of the Near East, of Asia, of the Americas, and he measured how long each one lasted, from rise to fall. Then he took the average. The average lifespan of a civilization, he found, was about 336 years. A few centuries, that is all. The worlds that felt permanent to the people inside them lasted, on average, a few hundred years before they ended, rise, last, end, over and over, across the whole record, in a rhythm. The scribes counted in hundreds of thousands of years and were wrong about the scale. Modern science counts in hundreds of years and is sober about it, but the shape they were both describing is identical. World's end, on a clock. Coincidence? Or the oldest true thing we ever learned, finally read back to us in the language of evidence? So, after all of it, the king list, the wheel of ages, the 5 suns, the travelling number, the cave in Meghalaya, what are we actually left holding? The safe explanation, the orthodox one, is clean and it is mostly right. The ancient records, it says, are myth. The shared number is either coincidence or the ordinary spread of Babylonian mathematics along. The cyclic vision is a natural human response to a world that periodically destroys parts of. The impossible rains are sacred arithmetic, not history, the trade roads. Itself, there is no lost super-civilization, no hidden message from before the flood, no code about the turning sky that we can read with any confidence, and every one of those statements is defensible, and a careful person should hold all of them. But notice what that safe explanation cannot quite dissolve. On a measurable clock, the stratigraphers and the lifespan counters have confirmed the very. It cannot dissolve the fact that the core claim is true. Worlds do end in cycles. It cannot fully explain why the exact number 432,000 sits in both. Thing the scribes insisted on, a Babylonian and an Indian account of the ages, a fingerprint sharper than coincidence usually leaves, and it cannot explain away the strangest thing of all, which is not in any single record, but in the pattern across all of them, that 3 peoples who never met, on 3 continents, each looked at their own world, and each refused to believe it was the first. The careful, evidence-first reading does not end in a lost continent. It ends with a recognition that the oldest documents on earth were written by people who knew. It ends somewhere quieter, and somewhere far more useful. Something we have half forgotten, that they were late, not early. Inheritors, not founders. One world in a long series, owing everything to the worlds that ended before them. We are the 7th, or the 5th, or the latest of a number no one ever truly counted. The count was always a way of saying the same humble thing. Not the first, not the last. One chapter in the dark, reading the chapters that came before by lamplight, and adding our own for whoever reads next. That is where the records leave us. Not afraid. Awake. The gentlest way to let the next one find you is to follow along, and then to let yourself, if this story found a quiet place in your night, drift, and if you have a moment before sleep, leave a single word in the comments, and tell me where you are listening from tonight, the city, the country, the hour on your clock. We read everyone, and there is something fitting in it, a roll call of the present world, the latest one, sent into the dark. When you are ready, The worlds before ours are waiting in the next story. The 6 at the cycle counts told the same calm way. Evidence first, wonder kept honest. For now, let the king list rest on its dark sand. Let the wheel slow. Let the 4 old suns set, and the 5th one hold a little longer. You are one quiet light, in one late world, under the same old stars that watched all the others. Drift down. We will count again, another night. Imagine waking with no alarm, no phone, no engine in the street, no light in the room but the one you made yourself. Welcome to Sapiens Untold. Just the grey hush of dawn, the smell of wood smoke and cold stone, and close beside you, the slow breathing of the people you love. Outside, the wind is moving over a frozen plain that runs farther than anyone you know has ever walked. This is how people woke for 100,000 winters. It is 20,000 years ago, and you are a human being exactly like me. The same heart, the same fear of the dark, and the same love of warmth. But your world is a world made of ice. Where great cities stand today, there is ice 2 miles thick. The sea lies about 120 meters lower than it does now. Where the waves of the English Channel move today, there is dry, cold land, and you could walk from France to Britain without ever wetting your feet. Now forget the picture you were given. Forget the brutish caveman, hunched and shivering at the mouth of a cave one bad day from death. That picture is wrong. These people did not merely survive the coldest world that ever was. They made a home inside it. They were engineers and tailors and artists and a family by a fire. So how did they do it? And what was it actually like to be alive in the age of ice? Settle in. Let yourself drift back slowly into the cold. Before we step inside the warm cave, we have to stand for a moment out in the open, in the world as it truly was. So picture this gently, with no need to hold it tight. But first, wherever you are listening from tonight, a warm bed in the cold north, a quiet room far to the south, a long drive in the dark, you are welcome here. If you like, leave a single word in the comments for where you are. A city, a country, an hour. People read them, and there is something fitting in adding your name to the long list of people who paused, in the dark, to remember the ones who came first. Then settle back, because we're about to walk out onto the ice. We should be careful with our words, because one phrase confuses almost everyone, and it is worth getting right once, calmly, so it never snags at you again. When people say the Ice Age, they usually mean one particular stretch of deep cold, the coldest peak of all, which scientists call the last glacial maximum. In the year 2009, a study in the journal Science, led by Peter Clark of Oregon State University, set out its timing with care. The great ice sheets stood at their fullest from about 26,000 years ago until around 19 or 20,000 years ago. That is the coldest window. That is the world we are visiting tonight. Here is the part that surprises people, so let us simply enjoy it rather than argue about it. We are, in a sense, still in an ice age now. The long cold era never fully ended. We are living in a warm pause inside it, a gentler interval that scientists call the Holocene. The ice did not vanish. It only drew back and let us breathe. So, if some quiet part of you wants to point out that an ice age is not really over, you are right and you can rest easy. We live in its warm afternoon. But 20,000 years ago, there was no warm afternoon. There was the deep cold at its very deepest. 2 enormous sheets of ice covered the top of the world. One lay over North America, and we call it the Laurentide. The other lay over northern Europe. the Fennoscandian. In places they rose nearly 2 miles into the sky, higher than most mountains you have ever seen, a slow white country of ice grinding south over the land. So much of the world's water was locked up in that ice that the oceans themselves fell. The sea stood about 120 metres lower than today. Whole coastlines that are now drowned lay open and dry. Shallow seas became wide, cold plains. The map you carry in your head, the familiar shape of the continents, simply was not there. And why did the world freeze in the first place? Not because of anything anyone did. The earth wobbles very slowly as it travels around the sun. Its tilt drifts. Its path stretches and rounds again. These slow rhythms, named long ago by the scientist Milutin Milankovitch, change how much summer sunlight falls on the far north. When the northern summers grow cool enough that the winter snow no longer melts, the snow stays and deepens and presses down into ice year upon year for thousands of years. That is all an ice age is. A summer that forgot how to melt the snow. Stand there a moment in that vast cold. The familiar map dissolved. Ice on the horizon in every northern direction. But this frozen world was not empty. In places it was the richest land that has ever existed. Now turn away from the ice wall and look south, to the great open country that ran in front of it, because this is the part almost everyone gets wrong. They imagine the Ice Age as a dead white waste, silent and starving. It was not. It was, in its strange way, alive on a scale we can barely picture now. In front of the ice, stretching from the western edge of Europe all the way across Asia and over the drowned land, into Alaska and the Yukon, lay a single vast grassland. Cold, dry, windswept, and covered for thousands of miles in tough, nourishing grass. Scientists have a name for this lost country. They call it the Mammoth Steppe. It does not exist anymore. There is nothing quite like it on Earth today. To understand it, we lean on the work of one man more than any other. His name was Dale Guthrie, the scientist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks who spent his life reconstructing this vanished world. In his book on the frozen fauna of the Mammoth Steppe, he worked out how such a cold place could feed such enormous herds, and his estimate, which we should hold as his careful reconstruction rather than as a flat certainty, was striking. He calculated that the Mammoth Steppe may have carried more grazing animals, pound for pound, across the land than the Great Plains of Africa carry today. A Serengeti of the north, in the cold. How could that be? How could a frozen world outfeed the warm savanna? The answer is one of those quiet truths that makes the whole picture suddenly make sense. The secret was that it was cold and dry, not cold and wet. Today's Arctic tundra is soggy, boggy and acidic, and the plants that grow there are slow and poor in nourishment. But the Mammoth Steppe was dry. The air held little moisture. The wind blew constantly, carrying fine pale dust, a rock flour ground out by the glaciers, which settled over the land and kept the soil rich. Dry, dusty, well-drained ground grows grass. Not soft wet moss, but real grass, deep-rooted and full of nutrition, and grass, in that quantity, feeds giants. So picture it now, in the low gold light of a cold afternoon, a plain rolling to the horizon, the colour of dry straw and pale earth, the grass bending all one way in a steady wind, a thin haze of dust hanging low, and out across that grass in the distance dark shapes, herds, moving slowly, heads down, grazing, the way cattle move across a field at dusk, but larger and stranger, and in numbers no one alive has ever seen. There is a stillness to this image that belongs to sleep, the wide pale land, the long light, the far herds, the endless patient wind. It is bleak only if you insist on it being so. Looked at kindly, it is simply a great quiet country, doing what it did for tens of thousands of years, with no one to hurry it. And this is the world our ancestors walked into. Not a barren waste they barely clung to, a larder, a hunting ground richer than almost any since. The cold was real, and we will not pretend it was not deadly. And the dust made the grass, and the grass made the giants, and the giants, in the end, made it possible for people to live here at all. There is something worth remembering in that. The very thing that made the world so hard, the cold, was also the thing that made it so rich, hardship and abundance braided together in the same wind. And across that grass moved animals that survive now only as bones in the frozen ground, and as a kind of awe in our voices when we speak of them. So let us meet them. Slowly, one at a time, the way you would meet them if you stood very still at the edge of that plain and let them come into view out of the dust. There is no need to fear them here. They are long gone. We are only remembering. First, the one whose name we gave to the whole world, the woolly mammoth. Picture an elephant, but dressed for the cold. A thick coat of long dark hair hanging almost to the ground. Beneath it, a dense woolly underlayer, and beneath that, a deep blanket of fat. Small ears to lose, less heat, and great curving tusks which it swept side to side to clear snow from the grass beneath. It stood as tall as a large modern elephant, and it moved across the steppe in family herds, led by the old females, exactly as elephants do today. Beside it, lower and broader, the woolly rhinoceros. 2 horns, the front one long and flattened, worn from sweeping the snow, a heavy body wrapped in shaggy hair. Slow, powerful, and not to be troubled lightly. Then the steppe bison in herds, dark and humped, the great grazer of the open grass. Now the predators, and here you must lower your voice, the cave lion, larger than the lions of Africa today, pale-coated, hunting the herds across the open ground, the cave bear, sheltering in the same caves that people wanted for themselves. And in the cold nights, the wolves in packs, the oldest rivals and oldest mirrors of the human hunter. There was the giant deer, which scientists call Megaloceros, a deer the size of a moose, carrying the largest antlers any animal has ever grown, a spread wider than a tall man with his arms flung out, raised above the scrub like a crown. And far away, across the drowned land in the Americas, the short-faced bear, long-legged and enormous, one of the largest meat-eating land animals of the age. With it ran the direwolf, heavier and stronger-jawed than any wolf alive now. This was the company our ancestors kept. Not a petting zoo and not a nightmare either. A working world of animals shaped, every one of them, by the cold. And that is the thread worth pulling as you drift. Look at what the cold did to them. The mammoth's wool and fat, the rhino's shaggy coat, the lion's pale winter colouring. Every one of these giants wore the cold on its body. They were built for it, over countless generations, by the slow, patient hand of the freezing world. Their bodies were the answer. Their kind had found to the question the cold kept asking. How do you stay warm? Now hold that question in your mind, and look at the one animal on the whole steppe that had no answer to it. No wool, no fat to speak of, no claws, no fangs, no great size. Thin-skinned, slow, and warm-blooded, in a body that had been shaped, originally, for the heat of Africa. That animal was us. By every rule of that frozen world, we should not have been there at all. We were a tropical creature, soft and bare, dropped into the coldest age the planet had known in a very long time. The mammoth had its wool, the rhino had its coat, the lion had its winter fur grown thick from the inside. We had none of it. We had to grow our warmth on the outside with our hands, by thinking. And that, in the end, is the whole story of how we survived. Not a stronger body, a warmer idea. To live among the giants, a soft, warm-blooded animal from the tropics needed one thing before all others. Before tools, before language even mattered. It needed simply to stay warm. So picture the inside of a cave now, at dusk, on a cold plain. The light is failing outside, and the temperature is falling with it, the way it falls in open country the moment the sun is gone, and low to the ground, near the mouth of the cave, there is a small, steady glow. A fire. We are so used to fire that it is hard to feel what it once was. So feel it now. It was warmth, held against a cold that could kill you in a night. It was light, in a darkness with no other light at all. It was safety, because almost no animal will cross a line of open flame. And out there in the dark were lions and bears and wolves. And it was the first warm room in the world. A circle of faces around it, and beyond the circle the enormous cold. This is the heart of the whole night, so let it settle deep. A fire at the mouth of a cave, with a blizzard moving past outside, is the warmest, safest feeling a human being can have. Warm inside, cold outside, it is when you think about it. Exactly the feeling of lying in a warm bed on a winter night while the wind works at the window. That feeling is not new. It is one of the oldest feelings there is. You are feeling tonight what they felt then. But here is a problem. The fire created, out on the open steppe. To keep a fire you need fuel, and on a cold grassland there are almost no trees. So how do you burn a fire where there is nothing to burn? They worked it out. They learned that bone burns. The fatty bones of the great animals, once a fire was hot enough to take them, would smoulder and hold heat for a long time. And on the treeless plain this became a real and deliberate craft. They burned bone where there was no wood. They gathered dried dung. They used every scrap the land gave them. And they made lamps, a hollow stone, a little animal fat, a twist of moss for a wick, and you have a small steady flame that will burn for hours, that you can carry to the back of a dark cave, that will not blow out in the wind the way an open fire does. The first lamps, light you could hold in your hand. We even know that they had mastered fire well enough to use it for things that had nothing to do with staying warm at all. At a place in what is now the Czech lands, called Dolní Věštice, people around 26,000 years ago were doing something remarkable with fire. They were taking soft clay, shaping it with their fingers into small figures, and baking it hard in the heat of a hearth. These are among the oldest fired clay objects known anywhere on earth. Thousands of years before anyone made a clay pot to cook in, people on the freezing steppe were using fire to turn mud into something that would last. They mastered the flame so completely that they could play with it. They could make art with it. Think about what that means. The fire was not only survival. Once it was tamed, it became the centre of everything. The place you cooked, the place you mended your tools, the place you told the stories, the place the children fell asleep and the old people kept the longest watch. The hearth was the oldest living room, and we have been gathering around it, in one form or another, ever since. The screen you may be glowing in front of right now is, in some quiet way, the same warm light in the same dark, the thing we gather toward when the cold and the night come down. But fire had one great limit. It could not follow you out onto the plain, and for that They invented something no larger than a splinter of bone. Picture the smallest, humblest thing in this entire story. Not a great fire, not a herd of mammoths, not a painted cave. Polished smooth, thinner than a matchstick, with one tiny hole drilled patiently through one end. A needle. Of all the clever things our ancestors made in the cold, this little object may have done more to keep us alive than any other, and almost no one ever thinks about it. Here is why it mattered so much. Fire warms you only where the fire is. The moment you step away from it, out onto the open steppe to hunt or to gather, the fire cannot help you. To survive out there, in air cold enough to kill, you have to carry your warmth with you. You have to wear it. A simple hide thrown over the shoulders is not enough in that kind of cold. The wind finds every gap. What you need is clothing that fits, sealed at the wrists and the neck. Layered, one garment over another, with still air trapped between, exactly the way a thick coat works today. You need tailoring, and to tailor, to cut pieces of hide and stitch them tightly together into a fitted shape, you need a needle with an eye, so you can pull a thread through and sew a seam that holds. The scientist who has thought most carefully about this is Ian Gilligan, at the University of Sydney. His argument, set out in his work on climate and clothing in prehistory, is quietly enormous. Tailored, fitted, layered clothing, he argues, was not a comfort. It was the precondition for living in the cold north at all. Without sewn clothing, the far northern half of the inhabited world simply could not have been settled by a tropical animal like us. The needle did not make life nicer. It made life possible. And the needles are real, and they are old. The earliest known eyed needles appear around 40,000 years ago in Siberia, in the very cold heart of the northern world. Exactly where you would expect the pressure of the cold to be greatest, people there were already drilling the eye, threading sinew and sewing. So picture the work itself, in the firelight. Someone scrapes a hide clean and works it soft. Someone splits a fine sliver of bone and rubs it smooth against a stone. Someone bores the tiny eye, slowly with a stone point, turning and turning. And then, by the light of a fat lamp, someone draws a thread of twisted animal sinew through the eye and begins to stitch a hood. That last detail is the one to hold on to. They were not only clothing the strong hunters, they were making warm boots for toddlers, lined hoods for infants, the whole apparatus of keeping a small soft child alive through a winter that wanted to kill it. The needle is, in the end, an instrument of tenderness. It is a mother, or a father, or a grandmother, sitting by the fire, making sure the little one will be warm tomorrow. The principle they worked out, the layered fur garment sealed against the wind, is the same principle the peoples of the Arctic have used ever since, and the same principle in the coat hanging by your door tonight. They invented it tens of thousands of years before anyone wrote a word, and they invented it not in a workshop, but at the mouth of a cave with cold fingers, because the alternative was to freeze. A splinter of bone with a hole in it. The whole northern world opened up because of it. Warm now and clothed, our ancestors did the thing that still stops the people who dig it up all these thousands of years later. They built houses, and they built them out of the giants themselves. Now go out onto the open plain again, far from any cave, where there is no rock to shelter under and no wood to build with, only grass and sky and wind and the bones of the great animals, and ask the question those people had to answer. If there is no cave and no wood, what do you build a house from? The answer they found is one of the most extraordinary things in all of prehistory. They built their houses out of mammoth. At a site called Mezirich, In what is now Ukraine, archaeologists uncovered the remains of dwellings made almost entirely of mammoth bone. The builders had taken the huge curved jaws, the long leg bones, the flat, broad skulls, and the great tusks, and they had fitted them together into round, sturdy shelters. The heavy skulls and jaws made the lower walls stacked and interlock. The tusks arched overhead to frame the doorway and hold the structure. Over this frame of bone they would have stretched hides, and banked earth and snow against the outside for insulation. Warm, solid, and able to stand against a wind that crossed 1,000 miles of open ice. These were not flimsy, lean toes. To build one took the bones of dozens of mammoths, and it took planning and many hands working together. A single person could not lift a mammoth skull, let alone raise a wall of them. These houses were proof, frozen into the ground, of a whole community pulling in the same direction. And we can be precise about one of them because of careful modern work. At another famous site, called Kostenki in Russia, there is a particular structure known as Kostenki 11. In the year 2020, a team led by Alexander Pryor of the University of Exeter published a study of it in the journal Antiquity. Their findings are worth holding exactly as they gave them. The structure was a great circle, about 12.5 meters across. It was built from the bones of at least 60 mammoths, and it dates to around 25,000 years ago, right at the onset of the deepest cold, the very threshold of the last glacial maximum. There is one more detail from Pryor's work that quietly changes the picture, and it is worth pausing on. Much of the bone in the structure was not fresh from the hunt. It was old, weathered, scavenged from animals that had died across the landscape and lain out in the open, bleaching before being gathered up and brought in. These people were not slaughtering 60 mammoths to build a wall. They were reading the land, finding the bones the steppe had already given up, and carrying them piece by heavy piece to the chosen spot. That is patience, that is foresight, that is engineering with the materials the world provides. Stand inside one for a moment in your imagination. A round room walled in pale curving bone, roofed in hide, with the snow banked high outside and a fire burning in the centre. The wind is screaming over the plain, but in here it is still, and warm, and close. The walls themselves are made from the very animal that ruled the cold, the mammoth, the symbol of the Ice Age itself. There is something almost defiant in that, and something tender too. They took the bones of the giants, and they made of them a place to keep a baby warm. This is what undoes the old idea of the brutish caveman completely and forever. A caveman shivering helplessly does not plan a 12-meter house. He does not gather the bones of 60 mammoths from across the landscape. He does not solve the problem of how to build a warm home where there is nothing to build with. These were minds at work, long-range, patient, cooperative minds, minds like yours. We have walked through their world, and we have walked through their home, but we have not yet truly met them. So stop here for a moment and ask the quiet question this whole night has been circling. What is it like to be as human as you are, and to be born into a world of ice? Sit with that for just a moment before we go on. Because everything we have looked at so far, the steppe, the giants, the fire, the needle, the houses, all of it has been about the outside, the cold and the clever answers to it. But there is an inside to this story, and it is the part that matters most, and it is the part the textbooks almost never reach. These were not lesser beings. They were not a rough draft of humanity waiting to be finished. The science is plain on this point, and it is worth saying slowly. A person living on the Mammoth Steppe 20,000 years ago had the same brain you have, the same capacity for language, for love, for grief, for laughter, for boredom, for wonder. If you could take a newborn from that world and raise it in a city today, it would grow up to be an ordinary modern person, and you would never know. And the reverse is just as true. Your own child, born into that cave, would have grown up to wear the furs and read the tracts and sit by the fire, and would have belonged there completely. They were not cavemen, they were us in a colder coat. So let yourself feel, just for a breath, what their days were actually made of. As you woke this morning into a body that wanted warmth and food and the nearness of other people, they felt the cold in their hands and complained about it, surely, the way you complain about the cold. They had favourite people and difficult people. They had children who would not settle at night, and old people whose joints ached, and young ones falling in love across the firelight. They told stories. We cannot hear them, but they told them, because every people who has ever lived has told them. They had songs, they had jokes, they had griefs that broke them. Every single layer of ash in every one of those caves was somebody's whole life. A person who was born, and was loved, and was cold, and was warmed, and laughed, and worried, and grew old, or did not, and was mourned. Not a statistic, not a stage in evolution, a life, as real and as full and as fragile as yours, lived out under the same sun and the same stars you can see tonight, only colder. This is the dignity at the centre of the whole story, and it asks nothing dramatic of us. It does not ask us to call them heroes, or to pretend the cold was not deadly. It asks only that we stop looking down at them, that we meet them at eye level, that we see, in the person crouched by that fire 20,000 years ago, not a primitive, but a relative, a grandmother, many thousands of grandmothers back, who kept the fire alight so that there would eventually be you. You come from people who did this. You are the warm room they were building toward, far down the line, without ever knowing your name. That is the quiet truth to carry into the second half of the night. Not that they survived, but who they were while they did it, whole, awake, as human as the person breathing softly beside you, or as you, lying here now, letting the day go. They were us. And like us, every single morning, no matter how cold, they had to get up and go back out into that world and find something to eat. So picture the morning of a hunt, not the way the old films show it, with shouting men flinging spears at a roaring beast. Forget that. The real thing was slower, quieter, and far more intelligent. The hunt on the mammoth steppe was won in the mind long before any weapon was thrown. To hunt the great animals, you first had to know them better than they knew themselves, where the reindeer crossed the river each autumn, which valley funneled a herd into a narrow place, how a wounded animal would run, and where it would tire. The hunter's deepest weapon was not the spear, it was knowledge, gathered over a lifetime, and passed down from the old to the young around the fire. And the tools were cleverer than we tend to imagine. Consider the spear-thrower, the device some peoples call the atlatl. It is a simple thing, a length of wood or bone, with a hook at one end, to seat the butt of a dart, but it works like an extra joint added to your arm. It lengthens the lever of the throw, and it multiplies the force, so that a light dart leaves the hand far faster and strikes far harder than any arm alone could. Send it, with a spear-thrower. A person of ordinary strength could drive a point deep into a large animal from a safe distance. It is one of the oldest machines in the truest sense, a tool that takes the power of the body and amplifies it. There is a newer idea about Ice Age weapons, and it is worth telling carefully, because it is a hypothesis and not a settled fact. In the year 2024, researchers named Scott Byram, Kent Lightfoot, and Judson Seri, working at the University of California at Berkeley, published a study in the journal Pielos I. They looked again at the famous stone points of the early Americas, the kind we call Clovis points, and they proposed something striking. Perhaps, they suggested, some of these points were not only thrown or thrust by the hunter at all, perhaps they were mounted on the ends of braced pikes, planted and angled toward a charging animal, so that the animal's own great weight and momentum drove the point home. The hunter would set the weapon and let the beast deliver the killing force itself. It is, to be clear, a hypothesis. Other scientists will test it and argue with it, and that is exactly how it should be. But hold the idea of it for a moment, because even as a possibility it tells you something true. These people thought hard about how to bring down an animal many times their own size without being killed in the doing of it. They turned the animal's strength against itself. That is not brute force. That is leverage and cunning and a deep, cold patience. Some hunts needed no weapon thrown at all. There is the way of the long chase, where people, who can keep moving and shed heat through sweat for hour after hour, simply followed an animal at a steady pace until it could run no more. The animal is faster over a short distance, but we are tireless over a long one, patience again doing the work that muscle could not. And much of survival was quieter still. The reindeer, with their thick winter coats and their predictable migrations, were a steadier prize than any mammoth. People learned the few weeks when the herds were at their best, and timed their year around them. They knew which plants under the snow could be eaten, which fish ran in which season, which birds nested where. The hunt was only the sharpest edge of a much wider, gentler skill, the skill of knowing a place so well that it feeds you. If you have been resting with us this far, and you would like the channel to keep making these long, quiet journeys into the deep past, you are welcome to stay with us, to follow along, or simply to leave it playing. Whatever you choose is enough. Because no one took a mammoth alone. Survival here was never something one person did. It was a band. Now picture a small camp at dusk, a handful of shelters, a few fires glowing between them, and perhaps 25 or 30 people in all, children, parents, grandparents, a few unrelated newcomers. This was the size of the human world, for almost everyone, for almost all of our history. Not a nation, not a city, a band, a group small enough that everyone knew everyone, and large enough to bring down a giant and raise a child. And the band ran on a single quiet law, the law that may be the truest secret of how we survived. They shared. Think about the mathematics of a hunt. A lone hunter, however skilled, fails far more often than he succeeds. Most days he comes back with nothing. If each person ate only what they themselves caught, almost everyone would starve in a bad stretch. But if the whole band pulls everything, if the one lucky hunter today feeds everyone, knowing that tomorrow it will be someone else's turn to feed him, then the wild swings of luck are smoothed out. Sharing turns a string of terrifying gambles into something a family can actually live on. Generosity on the freezing steppe was not a virtue laid on top of survival. It was the survival. The band that shared lived. The band that hoarded died. And the sharing went beyond food. It reached the people who could not pull their own weight at all. Far to the south of the steppe, and earlier in time, at a cave called Shanidar in the mountains of what is now Iraq, there lived an older kind of human, a man we would call a Neanderthal. His bones tell a hard story. He had survived for years with terrible injuries, a withered arm, a damaged leg. A man so hurt could not have hunted, could not have fended for himself, and yet he lived for years, with all of it, which means something simple and enormous. Someone fed him, someone tended him, someone decided that a person who could give nothing back was still worth keeping alive. That impulse, to care for the broken among us, is far older than our own kind, and it is one of the deepest, oldest threads in the whole human story. There was another kind of strength in the band that we tend to overlook, and it belonged to the old. In a world with no writing, where did knowledge live? It lived in the memory of the elders. The grandmother who had seen 60 winters knew which year the river froze early, which berries had sickened a child a generation ago, where the herds had gone in the last great drought. That knowledge could not be written down. It could only be remembered and told. The scientist Christian Hawkes at the University of Utah gave this idea a name, the grandmother hypothesis, the notion that long-lived elders, especially grandmothers, were a vital engine of human survival and success. On the steppe, an old woman by the fire was not a burden. She was the library. She was the deep memory of the band, and when she died, a whole archive died with her. And the bands were not islands. They reached out to one another across great distances, trading, talking, and finding mates beyond their own small circle, so that the blood did not grow thin. We can see the long reach of these networks in the things they carried: shells from a distant sea found far inland, amber, stone, and ornament moved across hundreds of miles hand to hand. A young person might be born in one band and live out their life in another, far away, carrying news and stories and skills between them. And yet quietly it was connected across the whole cold continent. This is the deepest comfort in the entire story, and I think you feel why. We did not survive the Ice Age as lone, strong individuals. We survived it through each other, warm, fed, and safe together, around a shared fire. And once a people are warm and fed and safe together, they begin to do something that no other animal has ever done. They begin to make things that are only beautiful. Here is the detail that should change forever how you picture these people. In the middle of the hardest conditions the human race has ever faced, with the cold pressing in and survival never certain, they made art. Not because they had to, not for any use at all, simply because something in them needed to. Go deep into a cave in what is now southern France, a place called Chauvet. Carry a small flame, because there is no other light this far in, and lift it to the wall. And there, out of the dark, the animals come alive. Horses, lions, rhinoceroses, mammoths, painted in charcoal and red ochre with a mastery that stops modern artists in their tracks. The creatures overlap and move, suggesting a herd in motion, and as your flame flickers, the shadows shift, and the animals seem to breathe and run across the rock. The cave of Chauvet holds more than 1,000 drawings, and by the dates set out in the listings of the World Heritage Organization, the oldest of them reach back something like 33 to 37,000 years, far older than any city, far older than writing. Made by people sitting in the freezing dark, by firelight, choosing to put beauty on a wall where it might not be seen again for an age. And Chauvet is not alone. At the famous cave of Lascaux, in the same region, people covered the walls with great bulls and horses and deer, a whole painted world beneath the earth. These caves are among the supreme achievements of the human spirit, and they were made in the depths of the Ice Age, by hands that an hour before had been gathering fuel against the cold. They made small things too that you could hold in a palm. Across Europe and Asia, people carved little figures, often of women. The figurines we now call Venuses. Some were stone, some were ivory, and at Dolny Vestonis, the place of the fired clay, one of the oldest was shaped from mud and baked hard in a hearth, thousands of years before the first pot. Tiny sculptures, carried, cherished, set down, and lost, the meaning of which we can only guess at across the gulf of time. But the find that says the most about the human heart in the cold comes from a grave. At a site called Sungir, in Russia, Dating to around 34,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered burials of astonishing care, and here we must be exact and lean on the careful reckoning of the scholars, rather than reaching for a bigger number than the evidence allows. The Cambridge journal Antiquity reports that one young person in those graves was buried with something on the order of 5,000 beads carved from mammoth ivory, and another with around 5,400. Sit with what that means. Each bead had to be carved by hand from ivory and pierced and polished. Scholars who have tried to recreate them estimate that a single bead took a long stretch of patient work, which means the beads on one body represent thousands of hours of labour, thousands of hours spent decorating the dead, spent saying, with the most precious and laborious material they had, that this person mattered, that their passing could not be allowed to be nothing. That is not the act of a creature merely clinging to life. A creature clinging to life does not spend thousands of hours carving ivory to bury with a child. That is the act of a being with a soul, in whatever way you wish to mean that word, a being who needs meaning as much as it needs meat, who answers death with beauty and grief with ceremony, even when the cold is at the door. This, more than the needle or the bone house, is the final proof of who they were. They had everything we have on the inside, the love of beauty, the ache of loss, the need to make a mark that says, I was here, this one was loved. And these were not people huddled at the rim of the world. They had spread to its very farthest edges, including a whole country that has since vanished beneath the sea. Remember the sea, pulled back about 120 metres from where it lies today. Now think about what that uncovered. All around the world, the shallow edges of the continents rose up out of the water and became dry land, land that is now drowned and forgotten, but that was then some of the most important country on earth. The greatest of these lost lands lay between Asia and the Americas, where the Bering Strait is now. With the sea so low, the strait was not water at all. It was a wide, dry plain, 1,000 miles across from north to south, a whole cold country joining the two continents. We call it Beringia, and it is important to picture it correctly because almost everyone gets it wrong. It was not a narrow bridge that people scurried across. It was a homeland, a vast grassland, part of the Mammoth Steppe, with its own herds and its own rivers, where people lived, and hunted and raised their children for thousands of years. They did not pass through Beringia. They lived in it. Far to the southeast, in what is now Southeast Asia, the same low seas joined the islands into another great landmass, a drowned country that scientists call Sunderland. Islands that are separate today were one connected world then, and people walked and paddled across it, reaching ever further toward Australia. And off the coast of Europe, beneath what is now the cold grey North Sea, there was a rich low land that joined Britain to the continent. It has a name, Doggerland, and it is a whole story of its own for another night. For now, simply know that it was there, green and game-rich, where the fishing boats trawl today. What moves me most about these lost lands is how far north people were willing to go, and how early. There is a site in Siberia called Yana, after the river it sits beside. It dates to around 32,000 years ago, and it lies well above the Arctic Circle, in the deep far north, in some of the harshest country on the planet. People were living there, thriving there, hunting there at a time when the great cold was deepening. They did not cling fearfully to the warm south. They walked toward the cold, into the teeth of it, and made homes at the very top of the world, because they could, because the needle and the fire and the bone house and the band had made them, for the first time, a creature that could live anywhere. And from Beringia, in time, people moved on, south and east, into a double continent where no human had ever set foot, into the Americas, a whole new world, empty of people, full of animals that had never seen a human hunter. The last great human journey of the Ice Age, out of the frozen heart of the North and down into lands that would one day hold cities no one could yet imagine. Think of the courage in that, though it would not have felt like courage to them. It would have felt like life, like following the herds over one more ridge and then one more, until your grandchildren were born under stars in a place your grandparents had never heard of. Step by step, generation by generation, a tropical animal with no fur of its own walked to the ends of the frozen earth and lived there. There is a kind of awe in it that is gentle, not loud. We tend to think of explorers as a later thing, men with ships and maps and flags. But the first and greatest age of human exploration happened in the cold, on foot, by people whose names are utterly gone, who carried fire and family across a frozen world to its farthest edges. But to reach those far edges, they first had to live through the deepest cold of all. So now we come to the coldest part of the night, and we will move through it slowly and gently, because there is nothing to fear here, only the deep cold and the warm answer to it, which is the answer this whole story has been about. Picture the depth of winter, at the height of the last glacial maximum. The days are short, and the light is thin and blue and brief. The cold is not the cold of a bad winter today. It is deeper and longer and more patient than that. The wind comes off the ice sheet itself, off 2 miles of frozen height, and crosses the open plain with nothing to slow it. The snow does not so much fall as travel, sideways, hissing over the frozen ground. And inside the shelter, the band draws close. The fire is fed carefully with the fuel gathered through the easier months for exactly this. The lamps burn their small, steady flames. The furs are pulled tight, the sewn clothing doing its quiet work, holding a thin, warm layer of still air against the skin. The children are tucked between the adults in the warmest places, and someone keeps the watch. That is the image to hold as you drift, not desperation, not panic, competence. The long dark was not survived by luck or by struggle alone. It was survived by preparation, by patience, by 1,000 small skills practised so well they had become calm. They had done this before. Their parents had done it. Their grandparents had done it. The winter was an old enemy, and they knew its face, and they had everything they needed to meet it. Fuel laid in, meat dried and stored, clothing mended, a solid roof banked with snow, people they trusted close at hand. There is something in this that speaks directly to anyone awake in the small hours. The long, cold dark held off by a small, warm light, and the nearness of people who love you. That is the human condition, stripped down to its oldest shape. We are creatures who make warmth in the dark. We always have been. Whatever is keeping you awake tonight, whatever cold has crept in around the edges of your own life, you come from an unbroken line of people who knew in their bones how to keep a small fire burning through a very long night. It is in you. The capacity is in you, because it was in every single one of them, all the way back. The night watch would sit, then, by the low fire, while the others slept, listening to the wind, watching the dark beyond the doorway for the green shine of a wolf's eyes, or the shifting bulk of something larger, and above, if the sky cleared, the same stars you can find tonight, only sharper and more numerous in that clean cold air than you have ever seen them. The watcher would have known those stars, named them in words we will never recover, steered by them, loved them perhaps the way you love a familiar sky. And then, near morning, the watcher would wake another to take the fire, and would lie down in the warm hollow they had left, and sleep. The fire passed from hand to hand through the dark, never going out. That is, in a sense, the whole of human history in one image. The fire, kept alive, passed on, through one long night after another, all the way down to you. They held on through it. Winter after winter, for thousands of years they held on, and kept the fire, and went their children into the cold blue mornings, and lived. And then, slowly, almost too slowly to see in a single lifetime, the world began to change. The ice began to loosen its grip. Picture the very end of the long cold, though no one alive would have noticed it ending. It came not as an event, but as a drift over thousands of years, so gradual that no single person ever stood in a thaw and said, "The Ice Age is over." It simply, slowly, warmed. The northern summers, by the same slow turning of the earth that had once let the snow stay, began to grow warm enough again to melt it, and once the melting outran the freezing, the great ice sheets, which had taken so long to build, began the long work of letting go. The edges retreated, year upon year. Meltwater ran off the ice in cold, clear rivers, braiding across the gravel plains. The white country pulled back toward the poles, uncovering land that had been buried for tens of thousands of years. And as it warmed, the world our ancestors knew began to dissolve. That great dry grassland depended on the cold and the dust to keep it dry and rich. As the air grew warmer and wetter, the steppe began to fail. In the north it gave way to soggy tundra and creeping bog, which had been held back by the cold for so long, began to march northward, tree by tree, closing over the open plains where the herds had grazed. And the giants, those great cold-shaped animals, dwindled. Their world was shrinking beneath them. Why exactly they vanished is a question scientists still debate, honestly and carefully, and we should not pretend it is settled. Some weight surely lay with the warming itself, and the loss of the cold, dry steppe they were built for lay with human hunting, as people pressed into every corner of their range. Possibly disease played a part. The truth is most likely a tangle of all of it, climate and people and chance woven together, and it would be wrong of anyone to tell you it was simply one thing. What we can say is that the world that had made the mammoth was ending, and the mammoth ended with it. The seas, fed by all that melting ice, began to rise. Slowly at first, then steadily, the water crept back up over the low-drowned lands. The 1,000-mile homeland sank beneath the waves, until only the narrow strait remained, cutting the Americas off from Asia. The rich land beneath the North Sea drowned. The coastlines began to take the shape we know today. Whole countries that people had lived in for thousands of years slipped quietly under the water, where they remain. There is loss in this, and there is no use pretending otherwise. A world ended, the world of the giants, and the open steppe, and the deep, clean cold. The people who lived through the thaw watched the certainties of their grandparents melt away. The herds thin the familiar plains turned to forest and marsh and sea. But they carried something with them into the warmer world that was coming. They carried everything they had learned, the fire, the needle, the sharing, the stories, the art, the deep skill of being human together against a hard world. They took it all forward, into a kinder age, and built in time everything that came after. The warm world we live in now is the world they walked into out of the cold, carrying us, unborn. We can be sure of all of this, of the cold and the giants and the thaw, for a quiet and rather wonderful reason. The proof is written in the ground, and now, in our own time, it turns out to be written somewhere else as well. In our own blood. Let us state plainly the thing this whole night has been quietly claiming, so that we can watch the newest science meet it. The claim is this, that people did not merely visit the frozen world, but lived in it, fully, even at its farthest and coldest edges, long enough and deeply enough to belong there. The bones said so. The bone houses said so. The high Arctic camps at Yarna said so. People made a home at the very edge of the ice. For a long time that was an argument from stones and bones alone. And then, a few years ago, the argument was answered from an entirely different direction, not from the ground, from a single child's genome. In the year 2018, the journal Nature published a study led by a scientist named Victor Moreno-Maya, working with the geneticist Eske Willeselv of the University of Copenhagen and with the archaeologist Ben Potter of the University of Alaska Fairbanks, who had led the excavation at a site in Alaska called Upward Sun River in the old heart of the Beringian world. The team had recovered the remains of an infant who had died around 11,500 years ago, and they had been able to read her genome, the full genetic text of who she was. What they found was quietly astonishing. This child did not belong to any of the known Native American lineages. She belonged to a population that had branched off near the very base of the family tree, a distinct and separate people who had lived, isolated, in the Beringian world. Scientists named this lost population the ancient Beringians. The child was the first clear genetic glimpse of them. A whole people who had lived in that cold northern land long enough and apart enough to become genetically their own. Now sit with the alignment, because it is the heart of this part, and it is beautiful in its quietness. The stones and the bones had said, people made a home at the edge of the ice, in the frozen north, and stayed. And now the genome, read from a single child by an entirely separate science, said the same thing, in its own language. A whole distinct people lived in the Beringian world long enough to become a branch of humanity, all their own. Approaching from opposite ends of the earth and opposite ends of a science, arrived at exactly the same truth. People did not pass through the cold. They lived in it, deeply enough to be changed by it, deeply enough to belong. Coincidence is not the word for that agreement. Confirmation is. Two honest ways of reading the past, the dug earth and the read gene, telling the same story, that the frozen world was not a barrier our ancestors barely crossed. It was a home they truly made. And that child, the infant of Upward Sun River, found in the Alaskan ground after 11,500 years, makes the whole story personal in a way no number ever could. She was buried with care by her people in the cold at the edge of the world. She was loved. She was as human as the child sleeping in the next room from you tonight, and in her tiny genome was written the proof of an entire vanished people who had made their home in the coldest country on earth. The people who tended the fire, who threaded the needle, who raised the houses of bone, who painted the caves and carved the ivory and shared the meat and kept the long watch through the dark, were not waiting in the cold for history to begin. They were already living it completely. We are not their distant successors. In our minds, in our blood, we are simply the same long line, still going, still keeping the fire. Which leaves the simplest and heaviest question of all, the one to carry down now into sleep. So let us lay it out plainly, the way an honest account should, before you let the night take you. The picture most of us were handed is the brutish caveman, a hunched, grunting figure, shivering at the mouth of a cave, dirty and frightened, living a short and miserable life, one bad day from death, just barely clinging on until real history could arrive and rescue him. That is the orthodox image. That is what the word caveman is meant to make you feel. But that picture collapses the moment you look at the actual evidence, because the evidence is specific, and the cartoon is not. Consider what we have actually found in the frozen ground, a tailored needle, finer than a matchstick, for sewing fitted clothing to live in the far north. Houses built from the bones of 60 mammoths, 12 meters across, planned and raised by a whole community, painted caves of breathtaking mastery made by firelight in the freezing dark, thousands of ivory beads, each carved by hand, buried with the dead in tenderness and grief. A band that shared everything, that fed its wounded, that carried its old people's memory like a library. A tropical animal that walked, on foot, to the Arctic Circle, and across a drowned land into a new world. None of that is the work of a brute clinging on. All of it is the work of minds exactly like ours. And here we must be careful, because this is where careless tellers overreach, and we will not. The truth is not that there was some lost super-civilization in the ice, some forgotten empire with secret technology. There was not, and the honest record gives no hint of one. The real story is both smaller and far larger than that. It is that ordinary human beings, with no more brain and no more strength than you have, walked into the coldest world that ever was, and did not merely endure it. They made a home in it. They were warm and fed and together, and they made beauty in the teeth of the cold. And every one of us alive today is descended from people who did that. You are here because they kept the fire. There is one last quiet wonder to leave you with. Remember that the long cold never truly ended. We're still in an ice age, even now. We are simply living in its warm pause, its gentle afternoon, the Holocene. The ice did not go away. It only drew back and gave us room. Everything we have built, every city and field and home, we have built in a warm interval inside a cold age that is not over. There is something humbling in that, and something steadying too. We are not separate from that frozen world. We are still inside it. We are just for now warm. Before the night closes. If this slow walk through the cold has helped soften the end of your day, the kindest thing you could do is leave a single line below, telling where you listened from, and how you are tonight. People read them. The comment sections of these quiet videos have become a sort of fire of their own, a place where strangers, awake in the dark all over the world, sit together for a while. Add your name to that. And if you would like the next story to find you, a gentle tap of the like or to follow along helps more than you know. All of it is completely optional. Resting here with us is already enough. Now let the rest of it go. Let the fire in the cave mouth burn down to deep, steady coals. Let the snow ease at the entrance, and the stars come out, sharp and clean, over the frozen plain. Somewhere close, the slow breathing of the people you love. The cold is outside. You are in here, where it is warm. The hunt can wait until morning. The world can wait until morning. You are the warm window that all those people, across all those winters, were walking toward. When you are ready for the next story, we follow this frozen world to its strange and sudden end, to the long winter that closed the Ice Age in what really happened during the Younger Dryas. For now, let the old, old night hold you the way it held them. Drift down. We will walk again, another evening.